Jason moved skillfully through the city, trying to avoid the congestion on the road. His hands were shaking, his nerves were on edge, and a man's voice came over the speakerphone. "No way. It's not Christina," he answered the call. "I understand your shock, Jason, but that's what we're waiting for you to identify. We need to make sure the woman on our table is your spouse Christina and not another." "I mean, she's quite young, only 31 years old. We wanted kids so badly," Jason reread. His insanely expensive sports car maneuvered between cars with ease. He was only a year older than his wife, but he already owned his own company and made a sizable profit. The family didn't need anything and was respected both in and out of town. Christina had long complained of chest pains. "We both didn't pay much attention to it," he spoke in a stream of voice. His unexpected interlocutor listened to him quietly, accustomed to the behavior of people in grief. "She worked hard. The whole business was kept up by the two of us." "No wonder, I can't believe it." His voice sounded completely broken. "I'm refusing all sorts of tests and autopsies in advance. There's no need for that at all. Christine has experienced enough pain in her lifetime. Let her body not be touched at the morgue," Jason said. Vadim was met by the pathologist Paul Williams. "You and I spoke on the phone." He, with a mournful face, lightly touched Jason Chuichi. "Come this way. This is spouse Christine." Jason made his way into a brightly lit room with green tiles on the walls. There was a body lying on a gurney under a sheet. Seeing the dangling arm, Jason exclaimed, "God," he struggled to hold back tears. As Paul Williams pulled the sheet away from Christina's face, Jason uttered, "That's my girl." "I'm sorry for your loss," Paul said. Third time on shift, he'd seen a lot of things on his job, but seeing the emotions of relatives of the dead was always difficult. Jason could tell by the look on his face how broken he was, but still held himself in check, not letting the tears spill over. He gingerly touched Christina's breathless face. "Christina's body is still warm. She was alive half an hour ago," he said painfully. "Why didn't I know this morning?" was the last time I'd talked to her. A few minutes later, Jason stepped out into the hallway and his face changed. He turned to the orderlies with a calm look. "Guys, I have a favor to ask of you. You won't be offended by the price. We need to get on with the funeral as soon as possible. An unnecessary fussing with tests and autopsies will only stall things. You'd better hurry up and release the body. Get everything ready." Jason held out a few bills to the greedy orderlies. "This is between you and me. Absolutely, we won't tell anyone," Alex promised. He and his partner Ben were frequently involved in illegal activities after serving time for extortion and hooliganism. The two prison mates had only managed to get jobs as morgue attendants. "I'm counting on you," Jason said. He was pleased with the way he'd set things up, but he wasn't in a hurry to leave for the office. He would still have to inform everyone close and familiar of his wife's untimely death, listen to tons of condolences, and receive many visitors. But for now, he had to make sure that Paul Williams wouldn't cause him any problems, and Christine wouldn't bother him again. Finally, he would be able to say goodbye to her for good. In the meantime, Alex and Ben were preparing to transport Christina's body to the funeral home. "Beautiful broad," was young yet Ben said, looking at Christina's face. "So, her hubby's not too devastated. What's on these rich people's minds?" "I don't know. First, he's all shook up over his wife's body. Now he just wants to bury it. But what do I care? The main thing is they got the money. There's not much to do. We're used to situations like this. I've only been out for 4 months. I'm not going back, okay? Don't worry. Everything will be fine. We just have to stay out of sight. Look at her. She looks alive. It's kind of creepy." Alex laughed. "Ben, what are you doing?" But still he looked closely at Christina. "Real, and her skin is soft." He poked a finger at her exposed shoulder and shuddered. "I've never sat like that, and I never will." Alex crossed himself. The voice of Paul Williams appearing made the paramedics wince. "Where are you taking her?" "I haven't done an autopsy yet." "Come on, comrades, bring her back here." Alex and Ben looked at each other. "But we had a deal with Jason. He said he refused to do the autopsy. He wants a funeral as soon as possible." "Busy man." Businessman Paul frowned and stepped out into the hallway, speaking to Jason at once. "I can't release your wife's body without an autopsy. In order for me to sign all the paperwork, I have to go through the necessary procedures. What will they give you? The situation is transparent to me. Christina died of a heart attack." "I agree with that. I don't want confirmation. I don't need any tests." "Are they going to bring my wife back to life?" Jason asked indignantly. He'd noticed that Paul Williams was a man of principle, so he wouldn't just neglect his professional duties and risk his reputation and career. "Come closer to me," Jason asked, reaching into his pocket for his wallet. "You'll be fine with that request." He handed Paul all the bills he had left. He raised his eyebrows in surprise, not at all expecting this turn of events. He hastily accepted the money and stuffed it into his pants pocket, so it wouldn't show. He looked around and leaned toward Jason. "Well, that's a different conversation," he said in a low, friendly tone. "I'm more than happy to expedite the transfer of your wife's body, Jason. I'm obligated to do the autopsy." "Fine, do your autopsy," Christine's husband snapped. But he calmed down. Now he didn't have to worry about the morgue staff. He'd bribed everyone, and they couldn't rat on him, or they'd be out of a job. If the orderlies lost a little, Paul Williams would lose his license, and if he decides to talk too much, without wasting a minute, Paul got to work. "Comrades, you see the body. We're going to do an autopsy," he commanded, looking at Alex and Ben. Only a few seconds separated Christina from the irreparable. "Don't touch her. Don't touch that woman," shouted suddenly across the hallway from some madman who had inexplicably found himself in the morgue. He was breathing heavily and holding his heart, trying to catch his breath. "Who the hell is this scarecrow?" Ben stared at him. Standing before them was the usual grubby hobo in dirty clothes, put together in a single set from several garbage cans. It was hard to tell the age of the tired man with the beard and bushy eyebrows. "Are you lost or something?" Alex addressed him. "Or are you having trouble with your head? Get out of here." "This isn't a circus for you. That's my wife. Don't hurt her. Call the police." And there was Andrew, frantically pointing his finger at Jason, who froze in place as if struck by thunder. He couldn't even find the words to shut the intruder up somehow. "Call me right now. What are you standing there for?" "Idiots." Paul Williams stepped out into the hallway. He looked sternly around at everyone present. "Christina was brought to you. She's my wife. Don't cut her. Call the police." "I'm begging you." "Okay." Paul nodded and pulled off his clean gloves. He immediately threw Jason an angry glare. If he'd known what he'd offered him the money for, he never would have taken it. The police arrived on the scene, and at first thought Andrew was crazy. "What do we have here? Drunken ramblings?" Russell Davidson asked tiredly, looking at him. "I'm neither drunk nor crazy. My name is Andrew Johnson, and Christina, who was brought in this morning, is my wife, or rather ex-wife Guliev." "The same one," Val gasped Harry, trying to get a good look at the unkempt tramp across from the missing businessman from 5 years ago. "The same one," Andrew nodded. "And this is him." He shifted his gaze to Jason, who had arrived and was prevented from slipping away before the police arrived. "Alex, Ben, this is my former friend Jason. Now I know. Everyone knows your sneaky nature." No one expected Andrew to lunge at his former friend and punch him as Jason flew off into the wall and landed on the back of his head. Val and Russell immediately grabbed him under the arms, holding him in place. "And I'll beat you with my own hands over her." "You rotten bastard." Andrew wouldn't stop lashing out. "Andrew, do you hear that? Do you hear that?" Jason shouted. "This is a direct threat of reprisal. You are all witnesses." The bickering of the men was broken by a loud female scream. Everyone rushed to the section where a terrified Christina was sitting on the floor with her knees wrapped around herself. Andrew dropped down beside her, covering her with his jacket and pulling her close to him. "My love. I'm here. I'm with you again." Christina was shaking. She was weak and scared. Several pairs of eyes stared at her in horror. "There's Tina. If you hadn't come running, she'd be as good as horsewhip by now," Ben gasped, realizing that Paul Williams had almost performed an autopsy on a living person. So he looked around at those present. Doctor examined the victim and sedated her. He pointed to Andrew. "You invited me." Ben nodded to him. "I'll stay to look after the victim. I need a pathologist." On the way to the police station, Andrew Johnson was shaking. He couldn't believe what had happened to him in just a couple of hours. Now his life was going to change. Everything would go back to the way it was before. He still hoped he could get it all back. But what worried him most of all was Christina's fate. He loved her so much. Even though he hadn't been there for 5 years, how would she be without him? Could he trust that pathologist? Andrew didn't relax. And then when Val Harry spoke to him, he got a mug of hot sweet tea and a good attitude. "Tell me in order," Val Harry asked him. He sighed, covered his eyes a little, and spoke. "Who do you know who I am?" 5 years ago, I was traveling to Lakeside to negotiate with Jason. We knew each other from university. We were economics majors together. We dreamed of owning our own business together, and we had the same vision of doing business. I thought of Jason as my friend, Andrew said, gripping the handle of his mug tightly, realizing how wrong he was. I knew him before I knew Cy. We vacationed together a lot. Sometimes Jason introduced us to his girlfriends, but his relationships never lasted long. I want to emphasize that I trusted Jason like a brother. I had no idea that he would betray me in such a way. Our meeting with potential partners in Lakeside promised a lucrative partnership. Jason and I were anticipating a huge profit, and we were overjoyed. And we were the young wolves in the newspapers. We were the role models of the youth. Everyone dreamed of such a meteoric rise. Our firm developed surprisingly fast. When everything was just beginning, we could not dream that not even a year later we would be able to afford to buy our own place. So on the 3-hour drive to Lakeside, I had a big meal before I got there, and Jason started begging me to stop on the way and get something to eat at a restaurant. I didn't refuse, nor did I suspect it. Even when the supposedly best restaurant, Mikhailovsky, turned out to be just a canteen with street hooligans hanging around it. They were on to us as soon as we got out of the car. Jason was never one for words and could stoop to any level to prove his superiority. Before I knew it, I was in the center of a scuffle. But I was the only one getting hit. I didn't realize it was Jason. He'd lured me into a backwoods neighborhood where no one knew who we were, hired some thugs, and got away with it. I was in a lot of trouble. I spent the night in the alley where I'd been beaten the night before. I woke up with a bad headache, and my mind was blank. I had lost my memory, and from that moment on I didn't even know who I was. A group of vagabonds took me in and taught me how to survive. Together we roamed from one village to another until we stopped here. I didn't realize how close I was to my former life. At one time I was an idol to its inhabitants, and then I became invisible. So today I went into the store for tea and a cake, as I always did in the mornings. Sometimes they'd let me eat right there and watch TV. That's how I found out about the news in the city and the world. Today there was a report about Christina's death. They said that millionaire Nestorov's wife had died of a heart attack right in the office of the firm Jason's in my firm. Christina's picture was shown close up, and something clicked in my head and I screamed in pain. Her face stirred up everything inside of me as the memory cells filled one by one. The store clerk was startled when I burst into tears right in the sales area. My beloved Christina had died. I couldn't bear the thought. And then I felt inside that I needed to go to the city morgue. I needed to go to the city morgue. I don't know how to explain it. Call it a premonition if you want, but I wasn't wrong. I was sure she was still alive, that I'd make it in time. Val, Harry, and everyone who watched Andrew's testimony was shocked. There was no doubt about it. Even with the appearance of it, it was safe to say that the story was told by a businessman who had disappeared 5 years ago. The story was incredible, even momentous. In one day, Andrew not only was able to remember himself, but also lost his wife, and then saved her from death at the hands of a despicable friend traitor. Soon the whole town was buzzing about the incredible incident. The police remained silent. But journalists got wind of the sensation anyway. The news began to report on the miraculous resurrection, the return of the businessman, and the true identity of his friend. By the time Andrew arrived at the hospital to talk to his beloved, Jason had managed to escape. "I'm not staying here," he muttered. As soon as the police rushed into the morgue, he looked threateningly at Ben and Alex. "What? Got caught up in an obscure scam? If you work, if our case, you'll regret it, buddy." Recently released from the colony, got his point, and didn't know who to be cocky with, who was better off not putting sticks in their wheels. "Doctor, how is she?" Andrew was only concerned about the state of Christine, who was in no hurry to talk to anyone after what had happened. She had given Russell Davidson a statement and asked not to be disturbed. After the dose of drugs that was administered to the patient, her body has weakened, but the drips will do their job. The other issue is the psychological state. Her mood is volatile now, so be prepared for tears or hysterics. It's not an easy situation, from what I hear, the doctor advised Andrew. He entered the room and froze for a moment. The same clear eyes of his now ex-wife stared openly at him. "Christina, honey, I'm so sorry. I didn't even know." She turned away, unable to bear the sight of the man she betrayed. "I thought you were dead. You were gone. I was a wreck. Jason was there for me. He helped me through my grief and helped me get back on my feet. He was there for me when I couldn't see anyone else. I don't think you can forgive me. I won't forgive myself after this either." "What are you talking about?" Andrew sat down in the chair next to the bed. "You didn't know, did you? You didn't know how sneaky and conniving he is. It's all a plan to eliminate both of us. You're just as much a victim as I am, but I married him. A year after you disappeared, I jumped into marriage." So recklessly, Christina sobbed. Andrew just put his arm around her. We'll get through this. If you still want to be with me." Of course, the ex-spouse's home was surrounded by reporters and cameramen. "When was Christina discharged?" Jason didn't distinguish himself here either. He didn't even offer Christina a change of residence after her first husband went missing. Jason simply took him out of the picture by taking possession of what once belonged to him. The firm the two young friends had started in the past was now owned by Jason and Christina. I need to get back to normal. I'm weaned on technology, Andrew warned his beloved. You gotta catch up. The current specialist is much better versed in our field than I am. It's okay. We'll live. The firm is still in place. Everything is working, Christina consoled him. You remember, I'm very capable. After Andrew's return, she went to work and involved him in the business. It saved her from the awkwardness of being with her ex-husband in the big quiet house. The past 5 years had changed both of them so much that now their relationship was going through a major crisis. They had breakfasted together, dined together, chatted politely, but did not broach the topics of concern. The police were relentlessly pursuing the sensational case, but Jason had vanished into thin air. He was elusive, vanished without a trace. When the decision was made to freeze his accounts to make it harder for him to get as far away as possible, or even to another country. The following came to light. Jason had thought of several contingencies in advance and transferred all the funds from his account to an offshore account. The authorities had no access to it. That made finding Jason much more difficult. Meanwhile, Christine and Andrew lived under the same roof as strangers. They each had their own burdens, but they were in no hurry to share them. Both were concerned about Jason's fate too. Denise and Jessica dreamed of the moment when he would be caught and brought to justice for all his evil deeds. At times, the ex-spouses spent evenings together, watching movies, talking about detached topics, not touching on the personal. They were afraid they wouldn't be able to catch up. Andrew could hardly believe that now they lived as if they were strangers. One night at dinner, Christine shared her worries. 5 years ago, we were newlyweds, made plans, and then fate broke everything for us. Can we get it back? For the first time in weeks of living with her, Andrew dared to take her hand without permission. My darling, just remember how it all began. Can't we do this anymore? Did everything inside us die when I was a vagabond and didn't even remember you? I still longed for you. I was in a lot of pain, not physically without you, but being separated from you hit me hard. They spent that evening sitting in each other's arms. Andrew and Christine took their time. They didn't want to scare away the trust that had been rekindled between them. The former couple reminisced about the moment they met. You had just graduated from the institute. Your eyes were burning. You had a red diploma in your hands. Andrew recalled with admiration. I even remember what you were wearing then. Yes, they didn't want to take me anywhere, Christina nodded. During my internship, I did very well. I was recommended to several firms, but none of them dared to take me to the States. I was counting on you so much. As a young company, your demands couldn't have been too high. When I saw you two lanky, self-assured businessmen, she began. Overconfident about what? Andrew resented her with feigned resentment. You should have seen yourself then, all self-important, though only 2 years older than me. I knew I had to wave my hair and flap my eyes at you, Christine laughed. And when you saw me in action, I never underestimated you, Andrew said. Of course, you impressed me with your looks, but without your knowledge, the firm would not have become so successful so quickly. You have helped us a lot, and you deserve to be the CEO. Andrew had had a difficult time in his previous career. He was once again a respected, wealthy man who didn't need anything, but he realized how far behind modern professionals were, regardless of his pride. He took a business course that covered the latest trends in the world of business and social media. We have a whole department dedicated to this, Christina explained to Andrew with a satisfied look as she took him around the office. 70% of purchases are made online, and the number of customers has increased due to delivery. Yes, everything has changed, Andrew nodded without regret. I'm jealous that I wasn't involved in every new phase. I'd like to see you grow. But Andrew had plenty to be sad about. The employees who worked at the company under Jason and Christina could only hear how clever Andrew is. They learned more from the news when he was reported missing. The boss's ex-husband had miraculously returned. Everyone expected incredible solutions, new breakthrough ideas from him, but they were disappointed. Andrew, understand, these are people of a different generation. They are younger, and they're tech-savvy, Christina told him. You can be angry all you want, but your courses are nothing if you refuse to put knowledge into practice. We got rid of the old methods a long time ago. You have to accept that. I know, Andrew admitted his mistakes. Even the junior staff look at me like I'm an ancient man. I'm trying to be someone they can count on. I want to do business wisely, but I need to get used to it. But it wasn't just the situation at Beloved's firm that Andrew was worried about. The results of Christina's blood tests, which were conducted to detect the presence of poison in her blood, made him nervous. Ever since his return, he had suspected there was something Christina wasn't telling him. "Christina, I'm done. I can't guess what's going on inside of you anymore," he said one day in the office. He didn't have the energy to wait until he got home. Christine had turned pale. It was clear she was caught off guard. "What you're about to hear could throw you off balance," she warned and lowered her eyes. "My blood test showed. You weren't poisoned, were you? They were clean?" Andrew couldn't help himself and apologized immediately. "No, that's not it. Anyway, I'm pregnant with Jason's baby, of course. I didn't know how to tell you that." Andrew was silent for a moment, sighed, and then spoke. "You were his already. Were you planning a family? I don't have anything to blame you for." "The baby was in no way to blame," Andrew said confidently. He saw no reason at all to keep such wonderful news from him. "I was afraid it would alienate you. We're already very careful with each other, and I'm so tired of living in constant tension." "Well, don't. It's not good for the baby." Andrew sat down on Christina's desk and put his arm around her. "I'm not going anywhere else. No one will bake me. And this baby is ours, no one else's. He himself wouldn't be happy with a father like Jason." Christina couldn't hold back the tears. She had held in all the excitement for so long that it didn't take long for relief to set in. She and Andrew would be a family again. They would have a baby just like they had once dreamed of. "I'm definitely going to have to get over my pride now," Andrew said, rocking Christina in his arms. "I'm not going to let you sit in the office this long. You'll rest at home. There are various useful goodies, but I will not lock you up and work remotely, of course, but you have taken on too much. The employees are relaxed. I recognize your grip now," laughed Christina, wiping tears. The whole truth was known, and she was no longer afraid of being rejected. Andrew remained just as sensitive, caring, and attentive. "We're going to have a family. I wanted my baby so badly, and now we will. Thank you for taking us in." Over the next few months, Andrew never ceased to amaze Christina. He shrunk his ego and began to adopt the experience of the new staff to fit in. Soon he was to take on the role of head of the firm because Christina had to take care of her health. She, of course, filed for divorce, and the former spouse was modestly signed after that in the registry office. At the time of Andrew's return, journalists did not stop following them on their heels, so the newlyweds acted cautiously. They hid Christina's pregnancy, and bodyguards did not allow reporters to approach near the house in search of another sensation. "Sooner or later, they will realize everything and will trumpet the child," Christina reassured her husband. "Soon I won't be able to hide my tummy. You are overreacting. It's what they do for a living." "Oh, it seems to me that soon I will have a 10-meter fence around the house." Andrew pretended that he had not heard anything. He was annoyed by other people's interference in their lives. Besides, he didn't want Jason, wherever he was, celebrating about the baby. Andrew's only dream was to keep his family safe from intruders. Next to him, Christina felt at ease. She began to trust Andrew more. The same tenderness that had driven them crazy a few years ago had returned. "You've become too tense," she said, rubbing his shoulders. "I don't know how you manage. You've changed a lot, and that makes me happy." Andrew proudly accepted the praise from his wife's lips, putting the family's well-being first. He found the strength to manage the firm. In just 3 months, he had to absorb a lot of new information, find an approach to the team, and take away some of Christine's worries. Now she was in the office much less often, but she held conferences with the staff via video link. And soon Andrew faced massive dissatisfaction from his subordinates. "Andrew Johnson, things are not looking good. The complaints about the pay cuts are increasing every day," said his deputy. "I know the situation. Jason has let us down. Funding has been cut dramatically, but employees haven't gotten their paychecks for months. Our market position is down. Everyone's working their ass to approve the application of those who wish to leave. We'll work with those who are committed, and I'll make sure they get a decent salary. It's fairer that way." Christina was as supportive as she could be of her husband. She hoped the police would find Jason and bring him to justice. After all, he had absconded with money that didn't belong to him alone. But as the months passed, there was no decisive news from law enforcement. Andrew returned home more and more irritable. The only thing that could calm him down was the thought of his developing son in Christine's belly. She was tireless. She didn't want to quit her job and often sat with her laptop until her husband came home and scolded her. "Honey, well, soon the baby will appear," he said, "and you can't take your eyes off the screen." "Come on," Christine replied. "I'm a businesswoman after all." It was as if Andrew had predicted the birth of little Peter. The baby wanted to be born that very night. Christine felt the sheet beneath her was wet. "Andrew," she pushed her husband with panic in her voice. "Andrew, wake up. I think it started." An anxious Christina was brought to the hospital by ambulance. Andrew was so worried that he was afraid to drive himself. The thought of his wife's agony was driving him out of his mind. "Please sign," he hurried the paramedic as he and his partner loaded Christine onto the gurney. "Andrew, don't tell them what to do. They know what to do," Christine said. Andrew paced the hallway of the delivery room. He couldn't understand why Christine was so much calmer than he was. It was scary to imagine what she was really going through. She must have prepared herself for labor, because she often repeated how she wanted to be free from the belly as soon as possible. And a powerless Christine forgot herself in a blissful sleep as the nurses moved her to a separate room for newborns. In the morning, when it was time to feed her son, the young mother was waiting for another blow. "What do you mean? What do you mean, Peter?" "No, you are something mixed up." She did not understand the first time demandingly. Looking at the nursing staff, "Do you mean to say that you lost my baby? Are you crazy? It's impossible." Andrew rushed to the maternity hospital as soon as he received the alarm call from his wife. The police also arrived on the scene immediately. Doctors and midwives scurried around the ward, but could not retrieve the lost baby out of thin air. "So Dana, who worked here on the night shift, is missing," Val clarified to Harry, questioning all the staff. "Find her right now." "I'll have you all locked up," Christina yelled at everyone. She did not give in to despair and tears, but frightened the whole maternity ward to keep them in the seats. "Honey, you need to calm down. You're still too weak." Andrew tried to put her to bed, but her spouse refused to do nothing. He used all his connections to engage the necessary forces to find the newborn. "Dana's not at home," Russell Davidson shared with his partner. "Neighbors say they haven't seen her this morning or heard her crying." "She has a house in Kuzminki," answered Dana's colleague Elena, who was called to replace the runaway employee. "She inherited it from her grandfather." "Did you know?" "We leave immediately." Val nodded to Harry Russell. "We know the address. We'll find out on the way. We need to find out about her relatives. Who was she seeing? Maybe this guy took the baby somewhere and stole it without thinking about the consequences. Or maybe he planned this whole thing a long time ago." That was absolutely no consolation to Andrew and Christina. Dana didn't hear when 2 police cars pulled up to her wooden house. She was too absorbed in the screaming of Peter, who didn't want to eat the mixture despite his intense hunger. "Hush, hush," Dana rocked him in her tired arms. "We need to be patient for a while. Soon he will come for you. You have not been abandoned, don't be afraid." "Dana Vlasova, immediately leave the house with the child," came a stern male voice into the horn. Dana knew she had no escape route, for her accomplice had not yet appeared. How had she trusted him so much? "Dana, I repeat, come out with the baby," Russell Davidson's voice urged. "Relieve yourselves now." Dana wrapped Peter in a blanket and opened the front door with one hand out in front of her. "I'm unarmed," she shouted, and an operative immediately ran up to her and took the infant. "I didn't do anything to him. I wasn't going to," she said through tears as she was forced to put her hands behind her back and handcuffed. Back at the station, a relieved Dana spilled the beans. "Jason Nestorov, my lover. We've been together for over a year. I knew he was married, but he said the passion between them was long gone, that they lived like strangers. But it was Dana who told me. Were you planning on kidnapping a child to raise together?" No, I don't know." Jason freaked out when he found out Christina was pregnant. Even though she'd gotten back together with her ex-husband, Jason had it all figured out. The baby's definitely his. He's got a lot of people he knows around town or owes money to. Knew when Christina's pregnancy was established. He never wanted kids. At least he never discussed it with me. I thought it was too early to plan a family, so I didn't ask. And Jason always struck me as a free spirit. I was surprised that he'd gotten so caught up in the idea of taking the baby for himself, and I couldn't help but help him. He was always persuasive, Dana admitted to her shame. "You know, he's the kind of man who knows how to find the right words to get his way. It's always happened to me. And now it's going to teach me a lesson. I could go to jail if you give us his exact location. Maybe you'll get probation." Russell took a good look at Dana. "I don't know where he's gone. Believe me, I'm not covering for him. Jason always does what he wants and doesn't answer to anyone. He's got his own thing going on, maybe illegal, and he always told me it was best not to get involved." Christina was ready to strangle Dana with her own hands, the one who put their son in danger. When you find that bastard, he'll answer for everything she told Val Harry, who had returned the baby to her and told her about the midwife's role in the case. He won't be able to get away with it. For double attempted murder, grand larceny, tax fraud, and child theft, he's going away for the rest of his life. Thank you. Andrew shook the policeman's hand. And please find him as soon as possible. We'd like to know that our boy is safe. Yes, and I'm worried. No matter how hard the police try. But the surveillance of Dana's village home had no success. Jason had probably seen the police cars and the commotion that had engulfed the village, so he didn't even go near the place where he hoped to meet his kidnapped son. But Christine and Andrew received good news. Russell Davidson told them. His accounts have been frozen, so now he cannot use them, no matter how hard he tries. And we know he's in our state. And his lack of money will prevent him from hiding well and traveling freely. Thank you, Christina replied. Please keep us informed. She was more comfortable with personal guards and police patrols on duty outside their home for security. When are we going to have a quiet life? Christina sighed. My little one. She looked at her son. I'll never hurt you. We won't. Andrew touched the little nose with his finger and kissed his wife. Anyway, we have to move on with our lives and raise our baby. Andrew continued to drive to the office every day, but often called home and asked Christina to show him his son. Congratulations, shouted his staff at the firm. May your baby grow up healthy for the happiness of his parents. And this is to your family from us. Amber, who kept the office clean, handed the director a basket with various badges and creams for the baby. Thank you so much, friends. This is new to us, so don't be surprised if I come in even more tired than before, Andrew said. The co-workers dispersed to their seats. Andrew made a few calls to organize a small banquet during lunch and treat his subordinates in honor of Peter's birthday. But a few days later, the irreparable happened. Andrew was sure he was among the last to leave the office. He saw Amber on the way out, finishing up with cleaning up the last rooms. See you tomorrow, Andrew, she said with a smile as she walked past. See you tomorrow. Amber, he didn't bother setting the alarm. He knew the cleaning lady would take care of that when she was done. He had only had time to drive away from work for a few minutes when he got a call about a fire. No way, he ahead and called the fire department. He was the first one outside the firm's building and ran inside. Andrew was sure Amber hadn't left yet and the building was already engulfed in flames. Amber, Andrew shouted. Call out. We need to get out now. The whole place is on fire. Amber, where are you? But the girl didn't respond. Amber had passed out because she was too close to the back room where the fire had started. Andrew didn't bother to expend any energy to put out the fire, though the thought that he might lose the building in the fire prevented sober thinking. Amber was saved at the cost of the burns on Andrew's face. He felt no pain due to shock, but Christina, who arrived at the scene of the fire, screamed when she saw his swollen face and cheek. There were burns on Andrew's body as well, but they could at least be hidden under his clothes. After being hospitalized and discharged from the hospital, Andrew became despondent. He couldn't look at his disfigured face and didn't want to show his son his face. He shouldn't see me like this. I'm scaring him, he fumbled with Peter. When Christina wanted to give him a baby, she would say, Honey, don't push him away. He feels like you're his daddy and he needs you. But Andrew was hard to argue with. Having lost his office in the fire, he didn't know what to do next, and his life was failing again. He'd missed out on his life's work when things were just starting to get better again. We'll try again, Christina reassured him, stroking his hair. We're both specialists, after all, except we don't have the money. We can't spend all our savings on starting from scratch. We have a child. We can't jeopardize his future. We have to be sober and live within our means. Andrew had to use a mask to appear in public. His appearance made others morbidly curious, and some even yelled or turned away with a look of distaste on their faces. Andrew managed to get a job in the office of a large company and worked hard for several months to prove his professionalism. He was now an ordinary employee, not a manager. Together with Christina, they loved to spend time with their son, tried to devote every free minute to him. But Peter's mother did not stay at home for long and gave him to a kindergarten. And he also got a job. Andrew no longer neglected his child and eventually came to terms with the way he looked. Peter adored his parents, always reaching out to them. The 3-year-old was inquisitive and made friends easily at daycare. Amber invited us to visit Christina, informed her husband. After Andrew rescued his former co-worker, she kept coming over to thank them and sometimes sat with Peter when both his parents were busy with work. I'm glad she met a decent man. And is like a mom herself now, Andrew smiled contentedly. You and she have become great friends. You could say we're kin now. After all, events like this bring you closer together. The years went by. with each day Peter was born. Andrew and Christine wondered where time flew so fast. "Here you are already a schoolboy," Christine cried after her son's first lineup, squatting in front of him. "You've gotten so big, Mom." "Don't cry," Peter wiped her tears with his warm palms. "There's a lot to be happy about. I'm going to grow up soon. I'll start earning a lot of money so I can give Daddy an operation." He's embarrassed about his scars. "You, my attentive boy," his mother hugged him. Unfortunately, the amiable Peter became the subject of bullying by the children at school. They saw Andrew, who always walked the streets with his head down and covered by the collar of his coat or jacket. "Your dad's a freak. Your daddy's a freak," the bullies teased Peter. "My parents call him Quasimodo," another goofy boy chuckled. "You don't call him that." "My dad's not scary," Peter defended his father, barely holding back tears of resentment. But his frustration only fueled the little brawlers more. "I'm going to go to school and make all the parents ashamed of raising their children," Andrew raged when he learned that his son was being teased again because of his scars. "But aren't they ashamed? Don't they know the pain they're causing him? Should we go together?" Christina suggested. "If neither the vice principal nor the class teacher will do anything about it, we'll find other ways. I'm sick of seeing my son in tears all the time, too." "It's all because of me." Andrew sat down on the couch, wrapping his arms around his head. He thought it was his fault that Peter was being bullied at school. "Don't you dare even think that," Christina declared. "We need to get all the parents together with the kids to explain to them how you got those scars. Peter needs to know that his dad Jason is a hero. He sacrificed his business, his health, and his looks to save another man's life. But who would do something like that? I'm guessing not many." "No need to change the hero," Andrew immediately echoed. The burns he had received had made him even more humble. More often than not in society, he wanted to be the most inconspicuous person. But Christina knew how honorable, honest, and decent her husband was. "Why should you, Peter, suffer for these ignoramuses?" "No, I won't let them bully you, not him." Christina still insisted, and in front of the entire class told off the very bullies who were mocking her family. But the effect of her fiery speech was short-lived. Now they weren't taunting Peter on school grounds, but harassing him on the bus on the way home. "Son of Quasimodo," Joel, who was sitting 2 seats down, said loudly to Peter. "Next, you freak. I'm addressing you." "Get off," Peter responded angrily. "So the dunce is hiding behind his mom's skirt, and his father didn't even show up for school," said the other bully. And they both laughed. Peter sat there, burning with shame. He realized that the adult passengers had heard everything, but no one even thought of standing up for him. At the next stop, when most of the people got off, Joel and Jack sat closer to Peter and started shoving him in the shoulder. "But where's your hero, Daddy? Then he won't protect you," the driver, who could now hear the mocking talk of the first graders, couldn't stand their insolence, and at the next stop made his way into the cabin. "What are you little kids picking on the kid for? Would I have to drop you off at full throttle?" His voice sounded menacing, so Peter's assailants immediately fell silent. "How can you threaten other people's children?" An elderly female passenger raised her voice. "You better ask why their parents aren't involved in their upbringing, unwilling to listen to the moralizing." Joel and Jack exclaimed goodbye outside. Peter exhaled with relief. "All right?" the driver asked him. "Yes, fine," Peter replied softly. "Thank you very much. They're always picking on me." "Get in the front seat. We'll chat." The man waved at him, returning to his seat. "What's your name?" "I'm Peter Nestorov," the man replied without a backward glance. "Nestorov. What's your mom's name?" The driver's voice changed. "Christina. Do you know her?" Peter didn't notice that the bus driver had fallen silent due to his attempts to suppress unsolicited tears. After all, he didn't just know Peter's mother, he was his own father. Jason had been leading the life of an ordinary man for several years now, but not because all his funds had been frozen by the police. The reason was different. The birth of his son had changed him. He clearly realized that Andrew would be a better father to the boy than he was, and his final act of revenge was the firm that the former friends had started together many years ago. In that moment, after learning that he had almost taken Andrew and Amber's lives with his own hands, Jason realized how low he had sunk. He was scared of himself. He was someone's father now, lying, vindictive, selfish. Could such a man be responsible for someone, be a role model? Jason was shocked to see his son, because he wanted to lay low and never be seen by him again. Let Peter grow up with loving parents who could give him a good upbringing. But now Jason realized that he had seen Peter before, that the boy was always coming home by this route. "Uncle, are you all right?" inquired the kid when it was his turn to come out. He sent the card to the machine and looked at the adult carefully. "Yeah, kid, don't worry. My allergies are acting up. That's what the tears are about. Take care of yourself. You don't let it hurt." Jason dared to ruffle his son's hair. In that moment, he felt as tender as he had ever felt before. Peter walked off the bus with a smile. leaving a completely lost Jason behind. No more bullies harassed Peter on the bus. They were less likely to pick on him at school, having chosen a new harmless target for their constant bullying. Now Peter came home from school in high spirits. He really liked the driver he had befriended. Entering the bus, the boy immediately stopped beside Jason. They talked quietly. "You have very beautiful drawings. Your victory in the contest is well deserved," he praised his son. "I used to like to draw when I was a kid, too. I haven't tried it in a while." "It's a lot of fun," nodded Peter with a smile. "From next year, I'll also go swimming." The friendship between Peter and Jason developed on its own. His father enjoyed every second he spent with his son and was glad that no one teased him anymore. Peter complained to him about why he was being picked on. "Mom says it's nasty," Peter candidly said. "My dad pulled a man out of a fire. Can you believe that?" He didn't wait for the firemen. He went into the flames himself. That's why he's scarred. Jason was hurt to hear that Peter and his family had suffered because of his terrible act. He often wanted to repent to his son, to tell him that it had ruined his dad and mom's life for a long time. But he couldn't take it out on the kid. If he confessed, Peter would hate him and they'd never see each other again. "So you made friends with the bus driver?" Christina asked her son. "Yes, he's very nice." Shutting up Jack and Joel, Peter happily shared. "I'll show him to you now." He reached into the phone's gallery. "I took a video of him driving the bus." Christina gasped and almost dropped her son's phone from her hands. She could clearly see her ex-husband. Panic gripped her. Jason had gotten close to Peter. God knows what he was up to. "Jesus, son," she shrieked. "Honey, what are you doing?" Andrew looked over her shoulder and froze. "Peter, is this your friend?" "Yes," the son said warily. He didn't understand why Dad and Mom were so tense. "Let's go to the police." Now, Christina said in her husband's ear, "I won't let him anywhere near me. He's definitely up to something," nodded a worried Andrew. The police worked quickly and arrested Jason. That same evening, his meeting with Andrew and Christine took place in the hallway of the department. "Forget about Peter. You'll never see him again. You bastard." Andrew grabbed him by his jacket and shook him. "I admit everything. Everything. Just let us communicate," Jason pleaded. The couple looked at each other, and their mutual enemy had changed visibly. His appearance alone suggested that he was truly grieving the crime he'd committed. "Peter is the only good thing I have left. I'm happy to have him," Christina said firmly. "As long as he wants to hang out with you." She and Andrew hated Jason with all their hearts, but they weren't going to lie to Peter because he had grown attached to his own father. Jason's trial was months away because the lawyer had to work up a sweat to try to build a defense for several violent crimes at once. Peter asked to be in the courtroom with his parents. "Are you sure?" Christina was worried. She and Andrew had agreed that they wouldn't turn their son against Jason. He'd be behind bars for at least 20 years anyway. "Lady, Jason's uncle's going to be charged, but he's got to have one family member." As expected, Jason was sentenced to 17 years. Andrew thought the sentence was too short to cover the atrocities he had calculatedly committed. Peter cried when Jason looked at him after the verdict was announced. He waved at his son, but couldn't muster a carefree smile. "Don't be afraid, son." Christine pressed him to her side and stroked his cheek. "Will you be able to write him letters?" "Maybe I'll see you when you're older," Andrew whispered. The couple knew that Peter knew the difference between right and wrong, and they didn't want to shame him for wanting to keep in touch with his own father. After the trial, Jason's account was frozen, and the money that belonged to Andrew and Christina returned to the family, and they were back in possession of their income. "Well, we can finally let you have these transactions." Christina jumped on her spouse and kissed him. "Oh my God, won't I ever feel those looks again?" Andrew exhaled, still not believing his happiness. It took a few treatments to make his face and body look the same as before, but almost. "You look different," Christine eyed her husband curiously. "You have a new husband now," he laughed and hugged her. "Daddy, and I love you. I love you." Peter added and joined his parents' embrace. "It doesn't matter to me at all," Andrew said. The couple hadn't realized for almost 8 years that they couldn't keep up, so they decided to invest in a new business, doing business for their own pleasure. Jason was no longer chasing any heights. "Christina, why don't we get into furniture? My father made everything with his own hands. I helped him a lot in the workshop, and I was pretty good at it before I started Jason's business. I even worked in a furniture factory and learned a few things, and then maybe we'll start our own company. We'll make custom, exclusive furniture." "Why?" "The idea is interesting," Christina nodded. "Just need to study the issue better and try it. While we have not invested anywhere, we can do different things and decide," said Christina. The couple decided to stop at the production of furniture, rented a room, bought equipment. They trained themselves and hired experienced craftsmen. Social networks did their job. and soon Christina and Andrew Johnson took orders from the first customers. The feedback on their burgeoning venture was flattering, and orders started coming in regularly. "I've been thinking of a few ways to attract customers," Christina said. "See when you're free." Christina handed her husband the list. She wasn't often involved in the furniture-making process, and was more involved in social media or painting pieces. "Easiest job ever," Andrew Johnson teased his wife, to which Christina playfully showed him her tongue, sitting with a paintbrush. After a year and a half of hard work in the workshop, the couple could not say that they tried in vain. They had recruited a staff of professionals who handled multiple orders every day to the delight of their customers. "I think we deserve a vacation," Christina once declared after a day of work, collapsing on the living room couch. "Me too," Peter shouted, plopping down next to his mom. "I finished with straight A's." "Well, then I'll just have to take my laborers to the sea," laughed Andrew Johnson. The family went on vacation with Amber's family. The company sprawled out in luxurious rooms, and in the evening did not sit on the beach in the cool seawater. Went on excursions, tried out sea rides, and even scuba dived. "Val Harry is your good boy. So talented and hard-working." Christina smiled at her friend. "Yeah, I sure got married well," Amber laughed. "I used to scrub floors in the office. Now I can afford a vacation at a resort like this." The week of vacation enjoyed by both families had added to their energy and strength, with some surprises behind them. Christina felt sick in the workshop when one of the handymen was heating up lunch in the microwave. "Oh my God, what is that horrible smell?" Annie clamped her hands over her mouth, realizing she was about to turn inside out. "Christine, are you all right?" Samuel Adamson, the foreman who was waiting for her outside the restroom, addressed her. "I don't know what to say," Christine said, and rushed to the stall again. When she returned a couple minutes later, she said, "I remember how my first pregnancy started. It looks like she's the one." "Well, congratulations," Samuel Adamson brightened, hugging her gently. "Thank you. But we need to make sure. Just please don't say a word to anyone. I want Andrew Johnson to be the first to know. Well, almost first." Christina quietly told this exciting news to her husband. Upon hearing it, he looked at her with delight. "Good girl, you're mine." He leaned down to her tummy and kissed through her shirt. "Andrew, I'm almost 40. Do you think we can make it?" Christina asked fearfully. "It will definitely work out. My good one." "Absolutely," he hugged his wife gently, feeling like the happiest man in the world. Waking up in a junkyard, the rich girl heard the dialogue of foreigners. And after learning about the inheritance, she pretended to be dead. "Hello, this is John and a new author story on my channel." It doesn't work like that. The light of day and bright light struggled to shine through the gaps in the old car tires stacked in a carelessly chaotic pile. Nancy wrinkled her nose. Her head was splitting and her mouth was dry, so dry her tongue seemed to stick to it. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't listen. Her muscles spasmed painfully. Where? How did she get here? Trying to remember anything but the excruciating headache was futile. The memories seemed to dissolve into a thick fog, leaving a void. Nancy looked around and could hardly believe she was in such a place. She was surrounded by piles of trash, rusty barrels, a couple of collapsed TVs from a bygone era, scraps of clothing and empty bottles scattered around the seated Cody. At that moment, she looked closer and made out two silhouettes standing by a pile of old tires. Rising on her elbows with difficulty, Nancy listened. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but the voices sounded familiar, with a slight foreign accent. "Need to be dealt with as soon as possible," one said. His voice was deep and velvety. "Papers." "The inheritance. I suspect George has managed to hide everything," the other replied in a melodic and calm voice. Nancy shuddered. The words she heard caught her inheritance papers in their country. She tried again to rise to her feet, but they refused to listen to her. Rising to all fours, Nancy slowly made her way toward the pile of tires. The strangers stood with their backs to her. Their silhouettes, illuminated by the sun's rays, seemed intimidating. She lurched. Her heart pounded frantically in her chest. What had happened? Who were these people? How had she ended up here? "No need to take any chances," the man with the velvet voice said. "We need to find someone to contest the will." "It's worth researching first," the other continued, and his voice was determined to investigate. Nastina was sure exactly what they were discussing, but the word investigate made her wince. She recalled vague images flashing through her mind. Running, deafening noise, bright lights, and then emptiness. Nancy sat huddled against the tires and pondered. The whole situation seemed absurd. The inheritance. Someone had hidden the papers. What kind of nonsense was this? We have to be careful. We've done enough damage lately, the man with the velvet voice interrupted her musings. Don't worry, I've thought of everything, the other replied. Nancy turned pale. A clear but eerie thought suddenly flashed through her mind. They don't just want to find the documents, they want to find her. She didn't know why she had decided that, but her intuition was telling her. This situation is very dangerous. Nancy glanced at the pile of trash where old boards were lying around and hastily began to gather them to build herself a shelter. I can't, she heard a voice that sounded closer than before. I can't wait so long. She froze. The men were already very close. Nancy quickly scrambled away from the boards and pressed herself against the ground, trying to blend in with the debris. She held her breath. Her heart was pounding in her chest as if it wanted to burst out. You can't leave her alive, the man continued. Oh, come on, the amount she took was enough to permanently block her memory. Believe me, she's safer now than ever. Nancy had no idea what these men were going to do to her, but she knew one thing: this was all very dangerous, and she needed to save herself. The girl looked at the pile of trash, then her gaze stopped on an old rusty barrel. She didn't know if there was trash in it or not, but she still decided to hide. Don't worry, she's safe now, she heard the last words of the men before they passed her hiding place. Nancy took a deep breath and lay down on the trash-strewn floor, maintaining her natural pose. The foreigners moved closer, stood for a moment, and then one of them shined a flashlight beam in her face. Why don't you check the policy? One of them asked in his native tongue. Oh, come on, I don't want to get my hands dirty. I'm ready. I can see that, replied the other squeamishly. And Nancy lay there in the dark and damp, listening for their next steps. Nancy didn't know how much time passed before she decided to come out from behind the barrel. The sun was already setting. The sky was draped with coarse clouds. Nancy walked over to the pile of trash, looking around. The strangers were nowhere to be seen. She took a few steps forward and found herself near old wooden booths that looked more like abandoned shacks. Nancy saw a fire burning in a small iron stove in one of the booths. She cautiously moved closer and peered inside. There sat an old man in a dirty jacket. His feet were wrapped in a blanket, and he was staring at the flames. Hello, Nancy said. The old man raised his head and looked at her. Who are you and what are you doing here? He asked in a hoarse voice. IA. Nancy, she suddenly stopped talking, not knowing what to say. She didn't remember how she had gotten to the junkyard. The old man did not hurry her. He continued to look at her with unchanging calmness. Lost, I suppose? He asked after a while. I don't know, Nancy answered. I don't remember. The old man sighed and took a large cast iron pot off the stove. Come here, he said, and warm yourself. Nancy went to the stove and sat down on a small stool. The master poured water into the pot and put it on the fire. You're freezing, he said, looking at her. You must get warm. Nancy nodded and looked at the flames. The fire was crackling, casting a shadow on the walls of the booth. Nancy, wrapped in a thin sweater, tried not to look at the old tramp. She was uncomfortable with the sight of this strange, stern man. His reticence made it seem as if he knew more than he was saying. My name is Mark Stevenson, he said at last, breaking the long silence. Nancy Roberts, the girl whispered. Mark Stevenson nodded. Nancy, he repeated thoughtfully. It's a beautiful name. She shrugged and tried to get comfortable in the chair, which creaked menacingly beneath her. What are you doing at the dump, anyway? The old man asked. She didn't know what to say. She didn't remember how she'd gotten here, didn't remember where it had all started. And all she could remember was feeling panicked, feeling threatened, and running away. I don't know. I really don't know, Nancy whispered. It happens, the host said and turned to her. The tramp's gaze was intense and penetrating. He paused for a moment, as if searching for words. I myself, he began, almost in a whisper, have already forgotten much of my life. Stevenson stood up, walked over to a dusty shelf where rusty tools lay and old photographs in yellowed frames stood. He took one of them, rubbed it with his sleeve. Here, he said, holding out the picture. This is me in my youth. The photograph showed a young, trim man in a military uniform. He was smiling as he held the hand of Nancy, a pretty stranger. That's my wife, Catherine, Mark Stevenson continued, as if talking to himself. It was all right. I was a pilot in the sky. And then he stopped talking, as if in pain. Then I was written off in the reserves for health reasons. I couldn't do without the sky, without freedom. Stevenson looked at Nancy, and there was a deep sadness in his eyes, but not despair. I was bored at home. On Earth I became ill at ease, not like I used to be. Catherine was tired of me. She wanted happiness, and I didn't know what I wanted. It was like living happily ever after. George was growing up. Mark Stevenson was silent again. His face was frozen in a sad expression. And then the disease took her. It was a tricky one. Sold everything, gave the last of it to save her somewhere. My son Johnny went to prison. Mark Stevenson took a glass of water from the table and drank it in big gulps. I tried to save him. Of course, I hired a good lawyer to get Johnny out on parole as soon as possible. But then these men came to my house in this big SUV. And they took the house away from me because his mom lost it in a gambling game. My Johnny put my dad's house on the line. They took everything away from me. I'm left in a landfill with a mountain of garbage. Stevenson grinned. Sad and hopeless. I'm glad I found this hut at least, and it had a whole oven in it. They say he used to keep watch. What's there to keep watch over now? What about your son? Nancy asked, feeling a wave of sympathy for the old man who had been so cruelly sidelined by life. I don't know, honey, Mark Stevenson answered. Despair flashed in his eyes again. I got my last letter from him 2 years ago. He looked at the calendar on the wall, dark with soot stains. That's 2 years, he whispered, as if talking to himself. Nancy put her hand gently on his shoulder. She didn't know how to comfort him, but she wanted to show him she was there for him. Don't worry, she said. Everything will be all right. Mark Stevenson smiled sadly. Thank you, he said. He looked up again and looked at the calendar. It's getting late, he said. Come on, I'll make up your bed. There's a spot in the corner. He got up and led Nancy to a corner of the cabin, where old mattresses and blankets lay on wooden bunks. Lie down, he said. The morning is wiser in the evening. Where will you go at night now? No money, no papers. Nancy lay down on the mattress and tangled herself in the blankets. Despite her fatigue, she couldn't sleep. She thought about Mark Stevenson, about his life of loneliness. She also thought about her own fate and the secret she couldn't remember. Don't be afraid, Mark Stevenson whispered from the darkness. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but the sense of danger she had felt from the start still did not let her go. She still remembered her name, but where she was now, who she was, and what her place in society was, she didn't understand. She didn't look like a girl. Her manicure was well groomed, though her hands were dirty. Clothes, too, could not say anything definite. They were all dirty, with fresh holes in some places, as if they'd been dragged on the ground. "What happened to me?" she asked herself in a whisper, looking up at the ceiling covered in black soot. "Why can't I remember anything?" Suddenly, scraps of images flashed through her mind: the countryside, the grove, the berry bushes, and Grandma Claire Johnson. "The tumor," Nancy whispered. "Well, of course." At that moment, the girl clearly smelled the odor of pine resin and the taste of ripe, sweet blueberries. The image of her grandmother came back to remind her wrinkles, the grid of deep, fate-carved lines on her face. Claire had taught her to distinguish edible mushrooms from poisonous ones, showed her how to weave wreaths of wildflowers, and told her stories of the forest spirits she said lived in every tree and bush. A picture flashed through Nancy's mind. There she was, a little girl in a red dress with white ruffles, chasing a butterfly through a meadow strewn with daisies. Next to her, smiling, is Grandma Claire, picking strawberries in a basket. Unfortunately, the creaking of the old cabin in the wind, the rustling behind the wall, and the grumbling of old Mark Stevenson drowned out the memories, preventing them from taking clear shape. She remembered picking mushrooms with her grandmother, and Claire Johnson had always said, "Take your time. The mushrooms aren't going anywhere." "Take your time," Nancy Grandma's voice whispered in her mind. And suddenly a scene flashed clear as a sunny day in her mind. She was no more than 10 years old. She was walking through the woods to get mushrooms. "Grandma, I'm going to walk a little more," she asked. "I'll see what else grows there." "Okay, but don't go too far," Claire Johnson asked. Nancy nodded and went in search of trophies. Step by step, fungus by fungus. Before she knew it, she was deep in the woods. All she wanted was to find the biggest, most beautiful mushroom in the world. The sun's rays, breaking through the foliage, drew fanciful patterns on the ground. Suddenly, little Nancy heard the cracking of twigs behind her back and felt a sharp, unpleasant odor. Looking around, the girl saw him, a wild boar. Huge and formidable, he stood a few meters away from her. Head down and panting, the boar seemed ready to attack. Nancy's legs gave out and panic gripped her heart. She looked around quickly. A tall pine tree grew nearby. Nancy had no doubt that the boar could climb the tree. But in this situation, every second mattered. She quickly ran up to the pine and climbed up onto the highest branch, pressing herself against the trunk. "Stay back," shouted the girl to the boar. But it only grunted and began to rub against the tree as if trying to climb up. Nancy sat on the branch like a bird in a nest and watched the beast. She felt fear, but something else was awakening in her, a strength she had never felt before. The boar came to the tree, stomping the ground with its hooves, trying to reach her. Nancy, trembling with fear, clung tightly to the branches, looking up at the beast's muzzle glistening in the sunlight. "Don't do it," she whispered, looking at the boar. The girl sat in the tree, gripped by an eerie fear, for at least an hour. The sun was setting, the forest was getting dark and cold. She was already desperate, thinking she would stay here when she heard a voice. Andy Parker, a gamekeeper passing by, heard the grunting of a wild boar. He approached a tree and spotted her. The man fired a shot in the air, chased the beast away, and the girl, roaring with fear and joy, finally climbed down to the ground. Nancy remembered the incident for a long time. It was a reminder to her of the fragility of life and the fact that even in the calmest place there can be danger. When she thought back to her childhood, she felt her heart fill with warmth and light. But in that warm light, like a shadow, loomed another, long-gone reality. Once her parents George and Anne, tired of desperate poverty, decided to go into business for themselves. They sewed overalls, the kind worn by workers building new homes, factories, and roads, and then sold them. Nancy remembered helping her mother color the fabric as a child, and watched with bated breath as her father worked wonders on the sewing machine, turning pieces of fabric into protective suits. Lying on the stiff homemade couch, she remembered another incident involving her parents. She had been 8 at the time. She and her mom had gone to the store. In the children's department, among the various goods, Nancy noticed a beautiful doll with blue eyes and pink bows. She asked her mom to buy one, but she refused, citing that they needed to save money because they had a lot of debt. Nancy was upset, of course, but her mom promised to buy her a doll later. But she never got a toy. And that incident is forever etched in her memory. Nancy, tangled in an old woolen blanket, lay on the hard couch, tears slowly rolling down her cheeks. She still remembered Daddy proudly showing her the first costumes he and Mommy had made, as if they were cloth toys. They were lying on a cot in their small apartment, fulfilling a dream. "Look, Nancy," George said, hugging his daughter. "This is our future." Anne smiled, stroking her husband's arm. There was a spark of hope in her eyes. Nancy smiled too, but couldn't take her eyes off the pile of costumes, as if expecting those were about to come to life. Since then, life had been a whirlwind. My parents worked non-stop. Orders poured in one after another. A second machine appeared in their small apartment, then a third, then a fourth. Nancy couldn't remember the last time she'd seen her father without a sewing machine. He had become like a robot, putting all his thoughts and energies into the business. "When do we get a vacation?" Nancy asked. Once, tired of the constant hustle and bustle, Anne sighed, stroking her daughter's head. "Soon," she answered. "Soon we'll have enough money, and we'll live in a big house with a big garden, and you'll be able to play all day long." Nancy wanted to believe it, but doubts gnawed at her from within. She saw how hard it was for her mother. She was getting sick a lot, but she kept working. Early one morning, Nancy woke up to a strange noise. She went out of the room and saw her mother lying on the floor, clutching her chest. "Mommy, Mommy," she shouted, rushing to her for Koshaliva. Nancy looked at her daughter with unseeing eyes. An ambulance had been called. "Honey," she whispered, "don't be afraid." Although the doctors came quickly and helped her, it was too late. Her mom died in the hospital before she could live the happy life she'd dreamed of. Nancy was left with her father and grandmother. George Williamson withdrew into himself, didn't talk, didn't smile. He just worked and worked and worked, as if he wanted to forget the pain that was eating away at him from the inside. One day, Claire Johnson suggested that Nancy go to a fortune teller. "Let's go to Agafia Fedorovna," said Grandma, holding in her hand a small icon. "It's worth a lot. She will help us for sure." Nancy didn't want to go there, but Grandmother insisted. They came to a small wooden hut on the outskirts of the village. It was dark and stuffy. A candle was burning on the table. Across from her sat an elderly woman with gray hair gathered in a bundle. "Hello," Nancy whispered, not taking her eyes off the fortune teller. "Hello, my dear," replied Grandma Agafia. "I know why I've come. Your mother didn't die of her own accord. From greed. She wanted to earn a lot of money, but she couldn't find happiness. And what will happen to us now?" "Will it be hard?" Nancy asked. "It's going to be hard," the fortune teller replied. "But you'll get through it. Just remember, Nancy, never trust strangers, especially those who speak a different language. They will bring trouble with them." Nancy looked at her grandmother and nodded, not knowing what was happening. Agafia shook her head and, breaking into a cough, extinguished the candle, letting the guests know that the reception was over. Nancy ran out of the hut, devastated and frightened. Deep down, she didn't believe in the words of some schoolgirl fortune teller, but she couldn't shake off the fear she felt. A few days later, she was sitting in her room reading a book. Raindrops were pounding on the window. Daddy was working in the workshop, as always. On the table was a black-framed picture of Mommy. Nancy took it in her hands and ran her fingers lightly over her face, as if wiping away invisible tears. "Mommy," she whispered, "I'll never forget you." Days stretched on, each one similar to the last. George Williamson also worked tirelessly, and Grandma spent her time caring for Nancy and reminiscing about what Anne had been like. The girl tried not to think about the loss, and did what brought her peace of mind, helped her grandmother in the household, read books, walked in the woods, picking mushrooms and berries. Sometimes she remembered the words of fortune teller Agatha Ferguson, but tried to push away the anxiety. 6 months after these events, George Williamson was called at night into town, where he rented a room and opened a tailoring shop. The city greeted them with noise, the smell of exhaust fumes, and a fog that enveloped everything around them. Nancy looked around in surprise and could not believe her eyes. In the village, life flowed leisurely. Everyone knew each other. The whole village was like a single organism. But here life was boiling, bustling. Everyone was in a hurry to get somewhere, not noticing the people around them. "What do you think, Nancy?" asked her father, stopping the car at the entrance of an apartment building. Nancy shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know what to say." "I don't know," she whispered. "You'll get used to it," he replied, putting his arm around her shoulders and helping her out of the car. There were many rooms in the apartment, but they were all empty, cold, uninhabited. Her father had taken a place on the top floor on purpose, to be away from the hustle and bustle. "We'll be fine here," he said, walking into the living room and sitting down on the couch. Nancy looked around. She didn't like this apartment. It was gloomy, empty, cold. "Where's my room?" she asked. "Room? You have two," replied her father, smiling. "One for resting, the other for studying." "Good, I'm happy with that," she replied. Dad went into the kitchen to make tea, and off to school Nancy went. After a few days, she was very awkward and at the same time curious. There were many children of her age at school, and everyone was different, not like in the village, dressed in fancy clothes, but laughing and joking a little. Nancy felt like a stranger. "Hi, I'm Nancy," she said, walking up to a girl with long hair who was sitting alone on a bench outside the school. "Hi, I'm Catherine," the girl replied, smiling. "Do you go to this school too?" "Yes," the girl replied. "I'm in 5th grade." "Oh, me too," cool Nancy replied. "Do you want to go to the cafeteria across the street with me?" "Come on," Catherine replied. In the cafeteria, Nancy had her first taste of pizza. "So delicious," said the girl, smiling. "The pizza here is really great," Catherine agreed. After lunch, they went to class. As it turned out, they were in the same class. Nancy sat at the last desk. She was uncomfortable sitting alone. "Can I come with you?" she asked Catherine, who was in the first desk. "Sure," she agreed. From then on, Nancy had a friend in town. Daddy was already working without a day off. He was making a lot of money, but he was still often sad. Probably couldn't get over the death of his wife. And the thought that it all happened because of money did not give him peace. Time flew by. Nancy was quickly getting used to the new place. She liked school. The lessons were easy. And Catherine, with whom she became friends, always helped her to understand. In addition, Catherine often shared with Nancy news about fashion trends, helped her to choose clothes and even cosmetics. Gradually, Nancy turned into a stylish, fashionable girl. She no longer felt like a white crow at school. With grades, too, all was well. She studied for B's and A's and had a good relationship with her classmates. Catherine was her best friend. They went to the movies together, walked in the park, shared their secrets with each other. Nancy felt perfectly happy, but sometimes she noticed that Daddy was becoming more and more withdrawn. He talked to her less and less, and more often sat in his room, immersed in thought. Nancy realized that something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what it was. "Dad, why are you so sad?" she asked one evening as they sat at the table. "Oh, nothing much," the man replied. "Just tired of work, I guess." "Of it itself," replied George. Nancy could see that her father was not telling her something. She knew that it was not the work that made him sad, but something else. But what was it? "Dad, can you tell me what's wrong? Maybe something hurts." "Oh, nothing hurts," Dad replied, "just standing on the wall." Nancy persisted in asking what hurt. Finally, her father couldn't take it anymore. "It's all because of Mom," he confessed. "I can't forgive myself for her leaving. I know her life was taken by illness, but I can't understand why she didn't go to the doctors. I think she didn't want to spend money on treatment. She was decent honest. She was also afraid of being a burden. I know my mom meant well, but she didn't have to do that. I would have given anything for her health." "Dad, it wasn't your fault," Nancy said. "You did the best you could, didn't you?" "No, it's exactly my fault," George replied. "I shouldn't have worked so hard and given so little time to my family. But don't be sad. It's all gone now. You can't bring back the past. You can only move on and try to be happy," objected the daughter. "You're right," Nancy replied the father. "I'll try." "I love you, Dad," she said. "I love you too," George replied and hugged her. But his daughter felt sorry for him, the same sadness still in his eyes. Time flew by. Nancy graduated from high school with honors and entered the university. She chose journalism as her major. She also studied foreign languages for personal development. Frankly speaking, she always liked writing and dreamed of becoming a famous writer. New friends and new interests appeared at the university. She participated in student competitions, wrote articles for the newspaper, and became famous in university circles. But sometimes Nancy still felt lonely. She missed her father. George still worked weekends and had little time for her. Nancy called him often, but he said he didn't have time. Dad complained that he had a lot of work to do and said he'd be here soon, but he never did. And then Dad had a woman of fatal beauty, Natasha, who came from abroad to his homeland about a year and a half ago. And it was as if Dad was replaced, like a man of age, but fell in love like a boy. Natasha was only 10 years older than Nancy. It's not for nothing they say, a graybeard is a graybeard. A graybeard is a graybeard. The wedding of George and Natasha was solemn and colorful. The groom, who was not old enough, was happy, literally glowing with joy. Natasha was wearing a spectacular dress of champagne color, which gracefully encircled the figure, a slender figure. She had long black hair, a beautiful oval face, and clear blue eyes. Deep down, Nancy was happy for her father. Natasha's relatives from abroad came to the wedding. They communicated in their own language, but Nancy understood them and tried to participate in the conversation. "Nancy, how do you like my relatives?" Natasha asked her in a strange way. "Very nice," Nancy replied. "But I don't speak German very well." "Don't worry," Natasha replied, "I'll translate." The guests danced to live music, drank champagne, and partied. George Williamson was happy and felt young and strong again. He was ready for a new life, a new chapter in his story. "Nancy," she turned to her daughter. "Thank you for coming. I'm so glad you're here." "I'll always be here for you, Daddy," Nancy replied. "You know that. I love you very much." "And you too," Nancy replied and hugged him. At that moment, she thought he had finally shed the weight of sadness and pain left behind by his mom's passing. After the wedding, George and Natasha moved into a beautiful house on the outskirts of town. They had a large garden, a swimming pool, but unfortunately his father was never able to give up his endless work, and therefore still as little time to spend with his family. Nancy understood that her father had a lot of things to do. and she knew that sometimes he couldn't just drop everything and come over. But still, she was sad. She wished Dad would just call and talk to her. Nancy tried not to dwell on how lonely she felt. Trying to find solace, she went to her studies. Student life was full of events, lectures, seminars, internships, meetings with the student creative group, concerts, theater productions. Sometimes Nancy really forgot that she was alone, especially when a friend appeared. His name was Sidney. He was a few years older than Nancy, but they shared a common passion for literature. "It's strange," Sidney once told her. "You write so beautifully, but all the time with a kind of sadness." "But everyone has a little sadness," Nancy replied. "Everyone has their own reasons." "But you're doing fine," said the boy. "Not really," she replied. "I had a mom, but now she's gone." "I'm sorry," Sidney said. "Let me help you finish your story." "You're very kind, but I don't want to hurt Daddy. I still hope he'll make time for me." "Don't be so naive," Sidney said. "You're an adult. I know he's busy. I just miss his attention." "I understand that. But you don't have to let him play games with you," he said. "What do you mean?" Nancy blurted out. "I mean, you should fight for your place in his life." "I don't want to fight. I love him." "Or do you think he's forgotten me?" "I don't know. Your father is very busy, and he must have forgotten that he has a daughter." "Don't say that. Please," the girl took offense. "I'm sorry, I don't want to offend you." "I understand you," Sidney corrected himself. "Thank you, Nancy. I want to tell you this. You're very smart, very beautiful, very talented, and I really like you." Sidney began stammering. She didn't know what to say. He was a good friend whom she respected, but at this moment she couldn't yet reciprocate his feelings. "I'm sorry, Sid, I'm not ready for a relationship yet," she said. "I understand," the guy said, "but I will wait." "You don't have to," she said. "Let's just stay friends." "Okay," Sidney said, "but I'll still be waiting." Nancy said goodbye and went to her dormitory. She was bitter that she had never been able to reciprocate his feelings. Deep down, she didn't want to build a relationship until she realized what was going on in her life. Nancy went to her room and made some entries in her journal, writing about her sadness, her father Sidney, and her dreams. Then in the evening, she sat in her room and read a book. Suddenly the phone rang. It was Daddy. "Nancy," he said, "I want to see you." "Daddy, where have you been?" "On another business trip," she exclaimed. "I'm in town," said George Williamson. "I'll come to see you tomorrow." "Why not today?" "A lot of things to do. My daughter's growing up." Nancy was very happy. She knew her father loved her, but he just had a lot of work to do. The next day her father came and brought her flowers. "I'm so glad to see you," said George Williamson. "It's good to see you too," Nancy replied. They sat down at the table, and the father talked about his work, about his plans. "I want you to know that I love you very much," he said. "And I love you very much," Nancy replied. Her father sat for a while longer and then left. As he did so, Nancy again noted the sadness and disappointment in his eyes. George Williamson's new wife was not at all like his first wife and increasingly focused on his business and income. Nancy continued to study, but her thoughts increasingly turned to her father George, who seemed unhappy in his marriage. George devoted himself entirely to his work, and his new wife Natalie had become a nightmare for Nancy in a matter of months. She did everything she could to make her stepdaughter feel uncomfortable in her own home. "You better not waste your time with that silly writing stuff," Natalie declared at every opportunity. You'd better pay more attention to your domestic duties. After all, you're not a little girl anymore. How are you going to support yourself if you're going to wallow in poverty? If I were you, I'd look for a rich groom. By the way, how do you like my new dress? I bought it in Paris. The stores there are wonderful. If you didn't waste your time on useless things, you could afford such purchases too. Nancy listened patiently to all the barbs, trying to ignore her stepmother's rudeness. I know you can't understand me, but I won't give up. I will study, and I will get my way, Nancy answered. And she really didn't give up. Nancy studied hard, wrote stories and articles, and gradually her talent began to bear fruit. Soon she published her first story in the newspaper. Nancy was very pleased that her work was appreciated. She began to write and publish more often in various publications, and received an award for the best literary creative projects. However, her joy was overshadowed by thoughts of her father. Seeing that he was not in good health, Nancy was very worried, but her father denied the problems in every possible way. "Don't worry, daughter," he would say over the phone. "I'm doing fine, I'm strong and healthy. And you don't forget to study. Finish university. I love you very much." Nancy, however, saw that her father was tired, coughing more often, having painful attacks, and complaining constantly of headaches. One day she came to visit him and saw that he was no longer able to handle his daily chores. "Daddy, what's wrong with you?" Nancy asked anxiously. "Do you look so bad?" Dad brushed it off, as usual. "It's all right, daughter," he said, but Nancy sensed something was wrong with him. He complained too often of nausea, headaches, and weakness. "Daddy, please see a doctor, I beg you. You need to get yourself examined. After all, you know that illness is better prevented than cured." Dad sighed. "I guess you're right, Nancy. I'll think about it." But he never did. He continued to work nonstop, taking no time for his health. Nancy graduated from the university with honors and began working as a journalist for the local newspaper. She wrote articles about culture, fashion, and city life. Nancy liked her work, which made her feel free and independent. But she did not forget about her father. One day she received a call from her stepmother. After a pause, Natalie informed her that her father had died. Nancy was shocked. She couldn't believe it, because she had always naively believed that her father would live for a long time. For the first few minutes, she couldn't say anything but cried. She cried not only for her father, but also for herself, because she couldn't be by his side during the last days of his life. Nancy couldn't even find the strength to leave the apartment. She did nothing but lie in bed and cry. It seemed to her that her whole life had fallen apart. That same day, Sydney came to visit her. "Nancy, I really feel for you," he said. "I can't believe your father is gone." She only nodded. Sydney sat down next to her on the bed and put his hand on Nancy's shoulder. "You know, I always thought your daddy was a very smart and strong man." "Yeah, you're right," Nancy whispered. "He was wonderful. I realize this is very hard for you right now, but please don't despair. You have to move on with your life." Nancy didn't answer anything, just stared at the floor. Sydney continued, "I know you don't want anything right now. But please don't shut yourself off. I'm always here for you. You can ask me for anything." "Thank you, Sydney," he said. "But I don't know what's next." "You can do anything. I believe in you." It had cost her a great deal of effort to begin making funeral arrangements for her father. Sydney had been by her side the whole time. Even at the cemetery, they stood with each other by the casket. As Nancy watched her father's face, it seemed to her that he was only asleep and would soon wake up. But of course he wasn't. The memorial luncheon was held in a home-like atmosphere. Nancy sat at the table surrounded by relatives. She was having a hard time. She couldn't eat anything, didn't want to talk. Natalie sat across from her with a haughty expression. Her eyes were filled with the thought of her late husband's inheritance. But Natalie did not know the most important thing, that her husband owned not only a network of garment factories, but also real estate in other countries, as well as a foreign bank account with $1 million. Most importantly, George had left the entire inheritance to his daughter. Nancy said with a sarcastic note in her voice, "Stepmother, you need to eat. You're so thin." "I can't," the woman replied. "No appetite." Natalie grinned, thinking about how she could get to the notary's office as soon as possible and get everything settled. How disappointed she was when the notary informed her that everything had gone to Nancy. Meanwhile, after the funeral, Sydney led the girl to her room and himself stayed in the living room looking through the newspapers. He soon noticed an article that a prominent businessman was missing in town. It indicated that the businessman was a cousin of George Williamson, and his disappearance could be connected with unknown criminals. At that moment, Sydney thought anxiously of Nancy. He could not leave her alone in such a situation. "Nancy, I've been thinking it would be good if you came to my place. You need some quiet time right now," Sydney said. She declined, replying that she would stay at her place. "I understand," Sydney agreed. "But at the same time, I'm very afraid to leave you alone. I'll get someone to watch you." Nancy sighed and said she needed to deal with her father's death. Sydney left the room and called her stepmother, Natalie. "I think it would be best if Nancy came with me," he said. "I don't care," she replied in a cold tone. "She's a grown girl. Let her decide where she wants to go." Sydney sensed that Natalie was trying to avoid responsibility again, realizing that there was no deal to be made with her. He decided that he would look after Nancy on his own. Sydney spent the night in the living room while the girl slept in her room. In the morning, he decided to talk to her again. "Nancy," he said, "I really want to help you. Well, tell me, what can I do for you?" Nancy looked at him with sadness in her eyes. "I don't know. I just need time," she replied. Sydney put his arm around her and said, "I'll be around for as long as you need me." "Thank you. I know you want to help," Nancy replied. Sydney smiled. Then 2 days later, Nancy received an email from an anonymous person. It said her father was in danger and could have been killed much sooner. The letter also stated the time and place of the meeting: the city cemetery, alley number 7, burial 148. Reviewing the letter over and over, Nancy couldn't believe what she read. Could it really be true? When Sydney saw her sitting at the table with the letter in her hands, he immediately asked what had happened. She silently showed him the letter. Sydney read it and turned pale. "Nancy, I don't think you should go in there. It could be a trap. Maybe you'd better call the police," he said. But Nancy only shook her head. In the back of her mind, she had decided at once that she could manage on her own. Sydney begged her to refuse, but she was firm in her decision. "Nancy, I'm very afraid for you," Sydney said. "I don't want anything to happen to you," Sydney said. "I know, Sydney. But I have to do it anyway. I'm a journalist, after all." "Or have you forgotten?" Nancy replied. Sydney shook his head, still not believing that she would actually go to the cemetery alone. All day long, time dragged slowly. Finally, by the appointed time, Nancy approached the cemetery. Finding the right spot, she looked around. No one. She breathed a sigh of relief. Nancy stood alone for a few minutes, thinking about something of her own. Suddenly, in the twilight, 2 tall men with masks on their faces came out of the grave. Their voices sounded cold and lifeless, like those of indifferent mannequins. "Well, hello," Nancy said, one of them in a foreign accent. "We've been expecting you." She flinched, for she couldn't understand who they were or what they wanted from her. "Who are you?" she asked with alarm in her voice. "We want to talk to you," the other man replied. "There are some questions." Nancy stepped back. She felt trapped. "Stay back. I'll get help," she exclaimed. The strangers grinned and took a few steps toward her. She backed away, knowing full well that she couldn't escape them. "Please don't worry," one of them said. "We just want to talk." In their eyes she saw not kindness, but malice and cruelty. And she realized with horror that they weren't going to talk to her at all. At the same instant, the men simultaneously grabbed her arms. Nancy cried out in pain and tried to break free, but they held her very tightly. She tried to resist, but the forces were unequal. The strangers threw her to the ground. Nancy closed her eyes in pain. "Calm down," one of them said. "No, and the first is not the last." They opened her mouth and poured some kind of liquid into it. Nancy felt a burning sensation in her throat, tried to protest, but couldn't say anything. The liquid quickly burned her throat, seeping into her bloodstream. At the same moment, Nancy lost consciousness, and a couple of strangers wrapped her body in a blanket and carried her to a car standing 100 meters away. It was only now, lying on the hard bed, that Nancy realized what a foolish thing she had done when she had come alone to the cemetery and become a victim. She awoke to someone gently stroking her arm. She opened her eyes and saw Mark Stevenson's wrinkled face. "Wake up," the old man whispered with a kind smile as he looked at her. "The sun is up, time for breakfast." Nancy tried to rise, but felt a sharp pain in her head. "Oh, did I really sleep all day?" she asked, trying to remember what had happened the night before. Overslept. Here's some hot tea for you. Take some bread and eat." "I've boiled some oatmeal porridge here," the old man said. "Thank you," Nancy whispered, accepting the cup. She was already determined to get out of this dark and damp-smelling hovel. But when she saw the bread and honey that looked so appetizing, she decided to wait until her grandfather calmed down a bit. "Why don't you tell me about yourself?" Mark Stevenson said with a smile as he looked at her. "Who are you, and what brought you to the dump?" Nancy wondered, not knowing how to explain that she had come to the cemetery to meet strangers, but those strangers had tricked her and drugged her with something. Still, after a little hesitation, she told all she remembered of the night, lying on the hard bed. "Well, that's good," said Mark Stevenson, looking at her with interest. "It happens that people get into bad stories and then find themselves in a difficult position. But there's no need to despair. Nancy, you and I are sure to find a way out of this." Mark Stevenson stood up and, machine correcting the cap on his head, said, "Let's go to the police. You need to report it. They'll help." "What am I? A former pilot. Now a tramp." Without waiting for an answer, the owner left the shack, leaving Nancy alone with her thoughts. She squirmed involuntarily, feeling the warmth of the cup and a certain nervousness at the realization that she would have to face the police. But on the other hand, there was no other choice. They walked along narrow, winding paths lined with garbage, constantly skirting the huge piles that seemed to take up half the village. Everything around them exuded a putrid odor. Nancy wanted to clench her nose, but she tried not to show her displeasure. They walked for about half an hour before they came to the outskirts of the dump, smoothly transitioning into the urban wasteland. "Here's the stop," Mark Stevenson pronounced tiredly, looking at the pavilion. "Let's wait, the buses run here." Nancy looked at the busy highway that ran past the junkyard. Cars were traveling at breakneck speed, leaving clouds of exhaust behind them. "Come on, Nancy. Let's go to the pavilion," Mark Stevenson said, nudging her lightly toward the bus stop. "There are benches there you can rest. Don't worry, I know the place. We'll take the bus to the center of town now, and everything's close by there." Nancy nodded. She was glad her grandfather was with her. He was reassuring, hopeful. Soon the bus pulled up and they stepped inside. Nancy quickly took the window seat, and Mark Stevenson went to pay the fare with change. Her mood improved noticeably. She finally felt like Nancy Carson again, a rich heiress who worked as a journalist and lived as an ordinary girl. The bus started, and Nancy watched the houses go by through the window. The landfill, with its garbage, rats, the smell of rot, and endless mountains of trash, was behind her. Everything was different in the city. The buildings were clean, the air much fresher. It seemed even the people were kinder. Nancy was overwhelmed with a strange mixture of relief and joy. After all, it wasn't every day that events like being kidnapped and left in a landfill happened. The sun was shining, and the rays caressed her cheeks like a mother's loving hands. She smiled at the sun, and to herself too. After all, life went on, which meant everything would be okay. "Here we are," Mark Stevenson said, bringing her out of her musings. A minute later, they got off the bus and headed toward the police building. "Don't worry," Nancy, her grandfather, reassured her. "It'll be okay. They'll help." Inside the station, she was greeted by a young policeman with a friendly smile and a penetrating gaze. "You must be Anastasia Carson." "That's a familiar face. Just saw it in the orientation," he asked, extending his hand. "Where's your fiancé, Sydney, waiting for you already?" "He's got everyone on edge. A scandalous fellow, I'll tell you that." Nancy was taken aback. And then her boyfriend came out in person. "Sydney," she whispered, not believing her eyes. Sydney put his arms around her and pulled her close. "I've been here for the last hour," he said. "Reported you missing. Officially, it was supposed to be a 3-day wait, but I insisted. Anyway, hot on the trail, they figured out who sent you the letter in the mail and who kidnapped you from the cemetery, and tried to eliminate you by leaving you at the dump." "And who is that?" asked the question that had plagued her all along. "Your stepmother's cousins Herman and Albert," Sydney answered. "Natalie didn't want you to inherit. Called them from abroad. She thought it would be easier to get rid of you than to try to divide the estate through the courts." "I still don't understand," Nancy whispered. "How could she do that to me?" "Long envious of you and your life," Sydney said. "Wanted all the power and assets centered in her hands." Nancy was silent, gazing into his face. She couldn't believe her stepmother was capable of such meanness. "And how did you know all this?" Nancy asked. "I know a little man who works for the police. He listened to me, and together we gathered information about your disappearance." "What about Natalie's brothers?" "They're already being interviewed. They'll be put in the detention center soon. Then the investigation, then the trial." "I still can't believe it. There's too much evil and deception." Sydney hugged her. "It's going to be okay. You're free. I'm with you." Nancy clung to him, feeling warm and protected. She also realized that Sydney was her only real family. "I'm so glad you found me," she whispered. At that moment, a woman in a black dress was led into the police station. Her face was pale and her eyes were red from crying. "Nancy," whispered the stepmother, walking up to her and squeezing her in her arms. "Forgive me, Nancy, I didn't mean to see you. It was all Herman and Albert. They made me do it. I didn't know it would turn out this way. They just promised to scare me a little." But Nancy didn't believe a word of it, especially after the investigation had revealed that it had been her stepmother who had added a drug to the late George Williamson's food, an overdose of which could cause cardiac arrest. Nancy looked at her with emptiness in her eyes. Natalie, who for so long had pretended to be caring, loving, who pretended to care about Nancy's well-being, actually wanted her dead. And all these years her stepmother had hidden her greed, her perfidy under a mask of virtue. As if reading her thoughts, Sydney pressed her hand against his. "You don't have to believe her," he said firmly. "All the evidence has been gathered. Her lies won't help." He understood her and pulled her close to him. "Sydney," Nancy whispered as Sydney held her hand and led her toward the exit. You don't know how grateful I am. You saved me." "Come on," he smiled. "You know I'm always ready to help." "I know," Nancy said, tears welling up in her eyes. "And I love you for it." "I love you too," Sydney replied, taking her hand gently. The sun was already at its zenith, painting the rooftops and sky in bright colors. When the young people left the police building, Nancy continued, "Sydney, you are the only one I want by my side, and I want you to be my wife." He pulled a velvet box from his pocket, opened it carefully. Inside glittered a modest ring with a stone. "Will you marry me?" She answered him with a tender kiss, silently saying yes. They decided to have the wedding on a motorboat. It had been Nancy's dream. She had always wanted a romantic wedding on the water, under the stars, surrounded by beautiful lights. Sydney did everything he could to make her dream come true. He booked a magnificent motor ship decorated with white roses and garlands of white lights, ordered the best orchestra in town that played magical jazz-style tunes, and hired the best photographer to capture every happy moment of the event. Nancy was the most beautiful bride. She wore a new white dress in the Greek style, a wide skirt and deep cleavage, which favorably emphasized her figure. Around her neck, she wore a pearl necklace that was impossible to take one's eyes off of. When Nancy went on deck and saw Sydney standing on the bridge waiting for her, Anne could not hold back tears of happiness. Their wedding was simply magical. Friends and relatives shouted, "Hallelujah," then they danced and sang together under the stars. Sydney and Nancy twirled in a slow dance, clinging to each other and feeling the love. Among the guests, of course, was Mark Stevenson, dressed in the uniform of a retired pilot, shouting with everyone bitter the former tramp couldn't stop crying, thanking fate for bringing him together with such good people. The first months after the celebration passed in a romantic atmosphere of happiness and joy. Sydney and Nancy lived together in a house by the river. Their bedroom windows overlooked the water, and in the morning they woke each other up with the sounds of the waves and birdsong. Sydney loved to cook breakfast for Nancy, making her delicious fresh fruit salad and strong coffee. And Nancy often sat on the balcony admiring the sunrise and wrote her articles. And in the evenings they would walk along the beach, holding hands, talking about all sorts of little things. Breathing in the fresh air, soaked with the scents of the river and greenery. Sydney smiled and, looking at Nancy, felt himself the happiest man in the world. And they both felt that their lives were just beginning. At the funeral, the husband couldn't hammer a nail, and as soon as the wife was lowered into the grave, the mistress whispered about the inheritance. The burial did not start with leaden gloom from the very morning. A fine rain drizzled continuously, as if nature itself was mourning her along with the few mourners who had come to the funeral. Dylan shifted nervously from foot to foot as he stood by the fresh graves. In his hands, he could hardly hold a heavy hammer and several nails, which he was going to hammer personally into the lid of his late wife's coffin. "Dylan, come to the grave," came the harsh voice of Priscilla, his mother. "My shoes are wet, and I'm wet myself. I don't want to catch a cold." Tricia, a spectacular brunette with bright red lips, stood a little farther away, wrapped in a light shawl. Her expression remained impenetrable. Little did they know that Tricia had been in an affair with Dylan for a little less than a year. "Mom, please don't rush me. It's a funeral after all," Dylan mumbled, trying desperately to get his trembling fingers on the nail head. "Exactly," Priscilla poked. "It's a lot of trouble with these funerals. It's a good thing you organized it quickly. Connections solve everything, as they say. And that Dr. Ethan was experimenting, and now he's under investigation. And his son could end up in an orphanage." Dylan remained silent, trying to hammer a nail in. The damp earth seemed to want to pull him into its cold embrace, along with the coffin. The rain was slowly turning the cemetery into a kind of damp and dreary realm. But no matter how many times he tried to hammer in a nail, it was all in vain. Either the wood was too hard, or Dylan's skills were at a child's level. "Dylan, maybe we shouldn't do this." The workers can do it themselves. They don't eat their bread for nothing. Priscilla reminded herself again. But her son only gripped the handle of the hammer tighter, like an experienced craftsman. You see, my dear, continued the mother, watching his clumsy attempts. I always told you that Chloe was no match for you. No match at all. That's all I've ever told you. Mom Dylan shouted irritably and threw the hammer into the dirt. Let's talk about something else, okay? Well, what else is there to talk about? I told you at the wedding, remember, that it was a mistake. You wanted a wife who was good-looking, so you wouldn't be ashamed to show people. Tricia, for instance. Priscilla wouldn't stop. Tricia, who had remained silent until then, coughed slightly, drawing attention to herself. Priscilla. Really, you shouldn't, she whispered, fixing a strand of perfectly styled hair. Let's do this some other time, okay? This isn't the time for this kind of talk. Why wouldn't it be? Priscilla frowned. Chloe is already on the other side of the world, and you're so young and handsome. Dylan, don't be a fool, don't miss your happiness. He looked at his mother expressively, making it clear that it was definitely not worth developing this topic now. All right, I'll be quiet. Priscilla raised her hands in a conciliatory gesture. Just make sure you nail it down tight, or she might decide to come back. Dylan gritted his teeth and hit the nail hard, but it bounced off the coffin lid with a nasty sound, like a spring, and fell into the dirt in front of the two gravediggers, who waited patiently for the command to begin the burial. No, I can't, he whispered, stepping back. Let's get out of here. Tricia, without a word, took him under her arm, Priscilla joining in. It didn't take much persuasion, and soon the three of them were heading for the cemetery exit, leaving the two gravediggers to do their usual business. Dylan took the lead rather quickly, leaving the women behind. You know, Priscilla, Tricia whispered as they walked a few steps away from the grave. She made a will before she died. I'm her personal hairdresser, her beauty master. But she had no beauty in her life. Priscilla, who had been vigorously making her way through the cemetery mud, stopped abruptly and stared suspiciously at her son's companion. A will? She asked, squinting her eyes. And what is in it? Did she give all her rags to her girlfriends down to the last trinket? Priscilla Adams has not rags, but a fortune. A horse farm. Can you believe it? She bought it just before she died, took all her money out of circulation and invested the last of it. Tricia jabbed dismissively, adjusting her expensive leather purse on her shoulder. Arabian horses. Priscilla Adams choked with surprise. What kind of, God forbid, elite horses? Tricia said meaningfully, enjoying the effect her words had. English thoroughbreds. Chloe, as it turned out, was well versed in this. Priscilla Adams, not believing her ears, sank down on the nearest bench. The rain continued, but she seemed not to notice neither the penetrating dampness nor the drops running down her face. Farms. Horses. She muttered to herself. And who was going to get all this good stuff now? Dylan. Who else? Tricia shrugged. He's the sole heir now. Priscilla Adams straightened sharply. A wicked light flickered in her eyes. Thank you, my daughter, for enlightening me. I didn't even know about it. I didn't really care for him. She said that, and Tricia, smiling to herself, continued her thought. Exactly, Priscilla Adams. Dylan is a city boy. He's a newcomer to the farm, no clue. Imagine what will happen if he, therefore, inherits the rights of inheritance, and what to do next does not understand. Oh, come on. This farm won't last long with an owner like that. He'll squander it all in no time, son. You'll see. I know him well. Priscilla Adams shook her head meaningfully. But if he had a woman with him who was smart, and knew her way around a horse, Tricia said, and gave Priscilla Adams a meaningful glance. "Well, that's a different matter." Her mother instantly picked up on the theme. "Then, my dear, you need to keep an eye and an eye to organize everything properly, and not to give a hand to anyone, and to keep Dylan safe from all the easy money hunters," Tricia added. "Sure," she said, taking Priscilla Adams under her arm. "Is that right? Oh, right?" Priscilla Adams let herself be led toward the cemetery exit. "We'll get through this, Tricia. We'll keep Dylan safe." The rain cried tears of sorrow and persisted, turning the clay soil of the cemetery into a shaky mess. One of the gravediggers, Ethan, adjusted a heavy burden on his shoulder and nodded to his partner. "Well, Ben, take the coffin. Let's go slowly, carefully, so as not to inadvertently." He didn't finish. They were afraid even to say aloud what their superstitious consciousness told them. Ben, a tall, thin, victim-like man of indeterminate age, nodded silently, accepting his end of the coffin. Soon they lowered it onto the special stands prepared for the final journey. At that moment, some quiet, barely audible sound was heard from the depths of the wooden box. Ethan, thinking that it was the wind playing with the dilapidated blanket, did not pay any attention to it. "The kingdom of heaven to the servant of God," he muttered, crossing himself. She was young, barely breathing. She had gone so early. "They say it was a tumor," Ben said quietly, adjusting the rope. "How do you know?" Ethan grinned. "From his hands. Dylan Thomas Eggle has already been to the netherworlds. Wow, what a beauty. I went to the modeling club with this widower when I was a kid." And Ethan, not sharing the talkativeness of his partner, suddenly froze. The strange sound from the coffin was repeated, this time more clearly. It was echoed by a muffled thud. "Ben, did you hear that?" he whispered, grabbing his partner's sleeve. "It's..." Ben started to say. But a distinctive groan came from the coffin. Ethan froze. The blood rushed from his face. Ben jumped back as if scalded. "Ugh," he whispered. "The cross is not good. Nothing good." The groan was repeated, longer this time, full of longing and fear. "What on earth is that?" Ethan couldn't stand it and cautiously, step by step, approached the coffin. "Ethan, don't do it," Ben exclaimed pleadingly. "Ethan." He hesitated for a moment, and then abruptly threw back the lid, which Dylan had never been able to penetrate. What he saw made him stagger backward. The fan's eyes were wide open and staring straight at him. "Jesus," he whispered, grabbing and "Chloe's alive." Ben, who had been standing off to the side until then, stepped closer and peered into the coffin, as if to confirm Ethan's words. Chloe blinked slowly, her lips pursed. "Water," she whispered. Ethan rushed to the pot of water they always took with them just in case. Ben, meanwhile, helped Chloe sit up. She was pale as chalk. Her hands were shaking, but there was a spark of insight in her eyes. "What's wrong?" Ben asked, handing her a cup of water. "How did you end up here?" Chloe drank greedily, without tearing up. When the cup was empty, she took a deep breath and began to tell some incredible story about how a medical error almost caused her death, about how she woke up in a coffin and realized that she was going to be buried alive. Ethan and Ben listened to her story with their mouths open, unable to utter a word. They were simple people, used to dealing with the dead, not the resurrected. "What do we do now?" Ethan finally asked. When Chloe finished her story, the question was addressed more to herself than to the woman. Ben scratched the back of his head, looking into Chloe's face. "I don't know," he muttered. "I've never seen such a thing in my life." Ethan, unlike his partner, pulled himself together quickly enough. "So first of all, we have to get out of here," he said resolutely. "Or relatives will come back and see you in good health and will be scared." Chloe, rising from the coffin, nodded in agreement. She still felt weak, but was grateful to fate for the second chance. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at Ethan and Ben. "If it weren't for you." "Oh, come on." Ethan waved his hand. "You're welcome." Ben helped Chloe out of the grave. The rain, as if by order, stopped, causing the gravediggers the feeling that nature itself rejoiced at her miraculous rescue. "Shall we go, old lady?" Ethan asked, looking at the woman. Chloe sighed sadly and gently took him under her arm. At the same time, Dylan and his companions hurried to solve the issue with the inheritance. The notary office was located in the very center of the city. Dylan with difficulty found a place for a car in the cramped parking lot and helped the women to get out. "Well, son, are you ready to become an heir to $1 million fortune?" Priscilla Adams asked with a smile as they walked up the wide staircase. "We're not exaggerating," Dylan murmured. But in his heart he was flattered by the new word millionaire. The office was waiting for them. A young secretary led them into a spacious office, where a man in a strict suit sat behind a massive desk. Come in," the notary pointed to the chairs. "I understand that you are about the inheritance of Chloe Degtyaryeva?" "That's right," Priscilla Adams replied, settling down in the chair. "This is my son Dylan Degtyaryov, and the only heir." "It's a pleasure," the notary nodded. "As far as I know, Chloe Dmitrievna left a will. Slowly, grandson." He opened the folder and began to list. So according to the documents, Chloe Dmitrievna owned a 30-head stable, a land plot of 10 hectares, residential houses and outbuildings. Dylan listened to him in the semi-darkness. Figures and legal terms merged in his head into a colorless hum. He was already drawing pictures of a new life, a luxurious mansion instead of a cramped apartment, an expensive car, traveling. However, the notary's voice sounded strange. "I must warn you that the property of Chloe Dmitrievna is under arrest." "What?" Dylan jumped out of his chair. "What arrest? What are you talking about?" "Calm down, son," Priscilla Adams put her hand on his shoulder. "Let's just get this over with." "What's that supposed to mean?" Dylan asked the notary. He sighed and fixed his glasses on the bridge of his nose. "It's very simple. As I understand, shortly before her death, Chloe Dmitrievna took a loan on the security of her property. The amount of the loan is impressive, and alas, she did not have time to repay it." "A loan?" Dylan looked at the notary confusedly. "But why did she need a loan?" "Exactly why." Priscilla Adams squinted. "Chloe, as far as I can remember, has never taken out a loan." "Well, we'll find out," Dylan whispered, clenching his fists. "I knew she was up to something." "Please, let's not have any of this theatrics," the notary frowned. "It's all legal. I have the loan documents with that." He pulled papers out of a folder and held them out to Dylan. He took the papers with trembling hands and began to read. Figures danced in front of his eyes, letters popped up, his head was spinning. "Well, what's to be done? How can we do this?" "There aren't many options," the notary answered. "Either pay off the loan in full, and then the inheritance passes to you, or..." Priscilla Adams leaned forward. "Or the bank seizes the property for debt," the notary finished. There was dead silence in the office. "So we get nothing?" Dylan asked hoarsely. "We're getting it, son. We're getting it big time." Priscilla Adams stood up. "We're going to fight. This firm belongs to you by right, and we'll find a way to prove that Chloe took this loan illegally." Saying this, she proudly walked out of the office, dragging her stunned son and Tricia behind her. The rain outside the window played out with renewed vigor, drumming on the windows and seeming to laugh at their misfortune. "Hang in there," Ethan said, and tightly gripping Chloe's elbow, helped her over the crooked fence of the cemetery. Now we'll warm up in the warmth, we'll drink hot tea with raspberry jam, and everything will seem like a terrible dream. Ain't that right, Ben? Ben, who was walking a little behind, nodded silently. He hadn't said a word since Chloe had come out of the grave, and he kept looking at her warily, as if he expected her to melt into the air like a ghost. The light in the old woman's window was quite close. Chloe, driven by cold curiosity, quickened her step. Petrovich, as far as she understood from Ethan's stories, was an iconic figure in the cemetery. A former gamekeeper who had served time for self-defense, he was known as a stern and taciturn man. But at the same time, as Ethan claimed, he had a golden soul. The hut of the old woman Stepan Petrovich was a small wooden hut, nestled at the very edge of the cemetery. Coming closer, Chloe heard the muffled barking of a dog coming from inside. Don't be frightened, it's Juchka, a kind soul. Except that she doesn't like strangers. Petrovich picked her up as a puppy. Since then they have been inseparable, Ethan explained. Noticing how Chloe tensed, he knocked on the door. The barking increased, joined by a hoarse male voice. Finally the door opened, and Petrovich appeared on the threshold. He was a sturdy grandfather with graying hair and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see through the man. He was wearing an old cotton jacket and rubber overshoes on his feet. To what do I owe the honor? He asked hoarsely, eyeing the guests suspiciously. Petrovich, I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour, Ethan began, trying to speak as conciliatory as possible. But here's the situation. It's urgent. It's necessary to decide. Without saying a word, the host stepped back, letting the guests inside. Chloe carefully stepped over the threshold and found herself in a small but cozy room. In the corner stood an iron bed, covered with a patchwork quilt. Opposite was a massive wooden table. On the wall hung a photograph of a woman in a scarf, and next to it an old clock. The bug, having made sure that the guests were allowed to enter, calmed down and now looked at the guests with curiosity, wagging its tail. Come in, don't be afraid, Ethan smiled, noticing Chloe's hesitation. The bug has already sniffed you. Decided you weren't dangerous. Chloe smiled shyly back and sat down on the edge of the creaky table. You need to change into something dry for starters, Petrovich muttered, turning to the guests. My wife has left her change of clothes just in case. Of course it's far from your size, but it'll do for the first time. He went off into the next room and returned with an armful of clothes. Here you are, he handed Chloe a sweater and a long skirt. And I'll put the tea on in the meantime. Chloe gratefully took the clothes and went to change behind the screen. Ben and Ethan tactfully went outside, luring the restless dog behind them. In the depth of her soul, Chloe was touched by the care of those people, recently completely unknown to her. Fate gave her a second chance, and she was determined not to miss it. Chloe came out from behind the screen, feeling a little awkward in a spacious skirt and a knitted sweater, smelling of lavender and something subtly homely. She sat down in the chair again, trying not to look at Ethan, who had returned to the house and was watching her closely. The hot tea and jam warmed her throat pleasantly, helping her relax. Where to start? Chloe muttered, looking at the carved patterns on the tabletop. My whole life turned upside down a couple months ago. Well, Preston squinted and leaned back in his chair. Take your time, start from the beginning. And Chloe began her story about how she lived with her parents in a small town when she was a child, how her father worked as an engineer at a factory, and her mother taught music at school, about how unexpectedly for everyone Dad decided to go into business and left the usual, so familiar business. Then they moved to the capital, where they bought a luxury apartment in the center and an expensive car. My father always dreamed of having his own business, Chloe continued, noticing the flicker of interest in Ethan's eyes. He opened a chain of small bakeries, and Mom devoted herself to helping Dad. You had golden parents, Preston said quietly, pouring the rest of the flavored drink into cups. They were the best. Chloe's voice trembled. She turned away to the window to hide her tears. Unfortunately, their happiness didn't last long. 5 years ago, they died in a car accident. Chloe was silent, unable to speak anymore. Preston nodded sympathetically. The silence was broken only by the crackling of logs in the fireplace. It seemed to me then that the ground was falling away from under my feet. Chloe continued, having collected her thoughts. I was all alone. But I had to move on. I had to do things, to solve issues with the inheritance. It was a heavy burden, Ethan said, for the first time raising his voice. Apparently, Ben didn't want to go into the story and went about his business. Yes, it wasn't easy, sighed Chloe. But I got through it. Lawyers helped to sort out all the formalities. Now I have my own business money, but it does not bring joy. I accept, nodded Preston. Money is not everything in life. What about the doctors and the clinic? You mentioned some kind of disease? Chloe took a sip of tea, gathered her courage. A few weeks ago, I began to feel bad dizziness, weakness. At first, I didn't pay attention. I thought I was just tired. Then I started having memory lapses. I was frightened, turned to the best specialists, lay on the examination in an expensive private clinic. And what did these doctors say? Preston asked. They said a tumor with difficulty pronounced these words, Chloe, not operable. They gave me no more than 6 months. Jesus, whispered Emily, pale. I could not believe my ears. My whole life flashed before my eyes because I had no time to do anything. My family, my kids, it was gone, and all I had left was money. What do I need it for now? Well, one Dr. Dixon tried to help, but it didn't work. Apparently it was a medical error, and they thought I was dead. She was silent, trying to deal with a wave of despair. Don't despair too soon, Preston said, smiling affectionately. I don't know what those townspeople have told you. I know how they like to get money out of rich people. But we have a doctor from God in our neighborhood. If you want, I can introduce with gratitude. Chloe looked at the old man. And his words sounded such confidence and strength that she involuntarily infected with his optimism. Thank you, she whispered. At that moment, Chloe's eyes clouded, especially after she remembered her husband and her acquaintance with him. She leaned back in her chair, and pictures of the past flashed before her eyes like a movie. A young, then still budding businesswoman. She was hurrying along the platform, desperately trying not to miss the train. She was clutching her ticket in one hand and dragging a heavy suitcase in the other, stumbling at every step. As always, Chloe grumbled to herself under her nose, I'm always late. Suddenly the suitcase caught on something and she, not keeping her balance, flew forward. Chloe had already prepared for a painful fall, but suddenly someone's strong hands picked her up, not letting her fall. Chloe raised her head and saw a clown in front of her, literally and figuratively. Bright, screaming yellow overalls, ridiculous red boatie, huge shoes, and a funny red wig with strands sticking out in different directions. He had funny makeup on his face, a white potato nose, and a painted-on grin up to his ears. He looked at her with a slight smile, and there were cheerful sparks dancing in the corners of his eyes. We're with you. It's all right. Mademoiselle, the stranger's voice was as unusual as his appearance. Yes, thank you, Chloe blushed embarrassedly, fighting the urge to hide behind her own suitcase. I'm just in a bit of a hurry. Let me help you. The stranger picked up the suitcase as if it weighed nothing. Where are you headed? To the sea, Chloe replied, still feeling awkward. Oh, what a coincidence, the man smiled radiantly. I'm going to the sea, too. Chloe couldn't hold back a chuckle. I'm sorry, she muttered. Just so unexpectedly handsome, the clown winked at her. I've had success with the ladies, you know. I don't doubt it, Chloe smiled. But you're not going to ride the train looking like that, are you? Why not? He adjusted his boatie with comical importance. I'm an entertainer. Dylan the clown. I beg your pardon, who Chloe introduced herself. It's a pleasure, Chloe. Dylan. Well, I suggest we pass the time together, and he gallantly offered his hand, not letting her bulky suitcases out of the other. To Chloe's relief and the surprise of the other passengers, when the train moved, Dylan went to the restroom, from where he came back in ordinary clothes, without makeup and clown costume. He seemed even more attractive, tall, with a strong-willed chin and kind eyes. Now that's different, Chloe smiled. When Dylan came back, I was beginning to think I was going to have to drive all the way to the sea in the company of a clown. Don't be afraid, I don't bite, Dylan grinned. Have a seat across from me. It's just my job. He told Chloe that he was going on tour as part of a circus troupe. It turned out that Dylan wasn't just a clown, but a hopeful artist, acrobat, and juggler all in one. Chloe listened with bated breath. She had never met such people, open, kind, cheerful. And where will you be from? Dylan asked. Chloe told about herself, her work as an accountant, modest life in a small town, and her dream to see the sea. They talked the whole evening, and when it was time for bed, Chloe caught herself thinking that she didn't want the day to end. I tell you what, Dylan, she said, as they were already lying on their shelves. I've never met a girl like you. You're so real. Really, she marveled. Yes, Dylan nodded. You don't have an ounce of falseness. You say what you think and do what you think is right. That's rare these days. She remained silent, but her heart beat joyfully in her chest. Chloe herself did not notice how much she had become attached to this unusual travel companion in just one day. The next day they drove to the sea. Dylan had to go to the hotel, and Chloe went to look for her aunt, whom she came to visit. Chloe, wait, Dylan caught up with her on the platform. I don't know if I'll see you again, but I'd like to, he faltered, then pulled a small red clown nose out of his pocket and held it out to Chloe. It's a keepsake for you, he muttered embarrassedly. So you don't forget Dylan the clown. Thank you, Chloe took the gift, feeling everything inside clench with sadness. I won't forget you either. They said goodbye and she walked away, clutching the clown's nose in her hand. It seemed to her that this was just a summer adventure that would never be repeated. But fate had decreed otherwise. My God, was it really us so happy, so carefree, Chloe thought, willy-nilly remembering the day of her wedding. Dylan in a strict black suit, with excitement, fire in his eyes. And she, radiant, in a luxurious white dress, with a bouquet of delicate lilies in her hands. And next to them stood the guests, joyful and excited. All except one woman, whose face in Chloe's memory remained cold and unapproachable, as if carved from stone. It was Priscilla Adams, who had never accepted her daughter-in-law. Their acquaintance began with open dislike, which later turned into a real Cold War. Chloe, accustomed to be a support for all around, tried to establish relations with her mother-in-law, but all her attempts broke down against a wall of arrogance and rejection. Come on, Dylan tried to reassure her after the next scene. Chloe is a beautiful girl. She loves me, and that's enough. She loves you? Priscilla Adams mocked him. And she's just screwing with you. You're talented, handsome. You could have found a better match. Dylan's voice trembled. But stop, please. I love Chloe, and we're going to be together whether you want us to be or not. Priscilla Adams begrudgingly accepted her son's choice, but her relationship with her daughter-in-law remained strained. Chloe tried not to pay attention to the oblique glances and caustic remarks, but resentment had accumulated in her soul. She loved Dylan with all her heart, dreamed of a friendly family, but these dreams were shattered by the harsh reality. So, girl, when can we expect grandchildren? This question Priscilla Adams asked at every opportunity, caustically pressing her lips. "Mom, we are not ready," tiredly answered for his wife Dylan, stroking her hand to smooth over the awkwardness. "Not ready to prolong the birth. How long can we wait? Time is running out. Or are you, dear daughter-in-law, going to build your favorite career instead of thinking about your family?" Chloe was silent, praying to God not to snap. With the money from the business of her late parents, she opened a large firm where everyone appreciated and respected her. But for her mother-in-law, it did not matter at all. In her eyes, Chloe remained only an upstart who dared to steal a precious son. Despite all the difficulties, Chloe and Dylan were happy, and their love, which was born in the very train that took them to the sea, grew stronger every year. "You know," Ben Dylan said, snuggling up to her after a hard day, "I'm so happy I met you then. You are my talisman, my happiness, my everything." Chloe caressingly stroked his hair, inhaling such a native smell, and the world around ceased to exist. In these moments there was no grief, no problems. There were only two hearts in love, who found each other against all odds. However, fate, as if testing their relationship for strength, prepared them a new test. During a performance in the circus, performing a difficult trick, Dylan fell from a height. Severe spinal injuries, the doctor ruthlessly stated. "It is necessary to operate urgently otherwise." He stopped, his eyes fixed on them. "Or else what?" Clinging to the last hope, asked Chloe. "Otherwise he will remain an invalid for the rest of his life," the doctor finished quietly, averting his gaze. The operation required expensive, abroad, at the best specialists in musculoskeletal injuries. Priscilla Adams didn't have that kind of money, and she was in no hurry to help her daughter-in-law, with whom she had not found a common language. "Nothing, do not worry," soothed her on the phone friend Maggie. "We will help you collect money, but we will not leave you in trouble." But Chloe planned to act on her own. She sold her apartment, her car, everything she owned. She even borrowed money from friends, co-workers. "Chloe, don't. I don't want you to do this. I do not want you to sacrifice everything for me," begged her husband Ethan. Chloe affectionately stroked his cheek. "How can I do otherwise? You are my whole life, my beloved husband. Yes, I would give everything to make you healthy." The operation was a success. Dylan was on the mend. He looked at her with endless gratitude and love. "You saved my life," he whispered. "I will be forever in your debt." After Dylan's discharge from the hospital, Priscilla Adams, to Chloe's surprise, did not even thank her, taking everything for granted. Despite the success of the operation with the circus, Dylan had to break up with it. It had been 8 months since the day Chloe had brought him back to life. 8 months filled with concern for her husband, worry for his health, and desperate attempts to regain the former ease in their relationship. But with each passing day, the wall of misunderstanding between them grew higher and the chasm of estrangement deeper. Dylan, once cheerful and carefree, turned into a withdrawn, irritable man. He sat for hours at the window, staring at one point. He answered Chloe's questions one syllable, or even did not speak at all. "Dylan, what's going on with you?" One day Chloe couldn't stand it, unable to bear the things of silence any longer. "You stopped talking to me at all?" I stopped smiling. He looked at her, as if not recognizing her. "It's all right," he mumbled, turning away from the window. "Leave me alone." Chloe's heart clenched with pain. Earlier he called her affectionate names, did not let her down from her loving eyes. Now, in his gaze read only indifference, if not contempt. She tried to regain his interest, to surround him with care and attention, as in the first days after the operation. Cooked his favorite dishes, bought tickets to the theater, invited friends. But it was all in vain. Dylan remained deaf and indifferent to her efforts. One evening, Sorting out the papers on his desk, Chloe came across a bright red card in the shape of a heart. There was no signature or address on it, only a few lines scrawled in sprawling handwriting. "I look forward to our meeting. Your bunny." Chloe felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. So that's what it is. He has another one. That thought made her feel as if she was burned with icy fire. She rushed to Dylan, who was smoking on the balcony. "What is it?" Chloe exclaimed in a broken voice, throwing the card at his feet. "Who is this woman?" The husband nonchalantly picked up the message, ran his eyes over the text, and indifferently threw. "I do not know what it's about. Probably someone mistook the address. Not me." Chloe's eyes flashed with anger. "I see how you've changed. You don't love me anymore." Dylan looked at her silently, and in his eyes Chloe was horrified to see something she had never noticed before: a cold emptiness. "Tell me, have you ever loved me at all?" With difficulty, Emily squeezed out, feeling the tears coming. Dylan didn't answer anything, just turned away, as if from an annoying fly. And at that moment, Chloe realized her worst fears were confirmed. There was no room for her in his heart. The next days stretched like in a fog. She felt devastated, broken. She had lost everything: her beloved husband, the meaning of life, hope for the future. One morning when she woke up, she felt sick. Her head was spinning, her eyes were swimming, and her whole body felt so weak that she could hardly move. Chloe tried to call Dylan, but his voice sounded like a hoarse whisper. Gathering the rest of her strength, she reached for her cell phone and dialed the number of the ambulance. The hospital had found a tumor. Doctors talked about a complex operation, long rehabilitation, that the chances of a full recovery are small. But Chloe did not care much. She did not care whether she survived or not. Her husband, having learned about her illness, did not show a single drop of sympathy or concern, just dryly threw, "I hope it will not take long," and left, slamming the door. At this moment, Chloe realized that she had finally lost her husband. He became a stranger to her, like a distant star, on which she had once made her wish. And time in the hospital flowed like molasses. Days were replaced by nights, merging into a colorless succession of pain, weakness, and apathy. She had little hope of recovery. The doctors, as if conspiring, spoke of surgery with reluctance, as if delaying the inevitable. Who cares, Tricia thought. Dylan had betrayed her, trampled on her heart, leaving only a gaping void. One morning, an unfamiliar doctor entered the room, tall, with a piercing gaze. Dixon radiated calmness and confidence. "My name is Dixon," he introduced himself. "I think I can help you." Emily raised an eyebrow incredulously. There was power in his voice, but the rumors about him were most contradictory. They said he used unconventional treatments that weren't recognized by official science. Help? Adam grinned bitterly. "You're too late, doctor. My disease is incurable." Dixon crouched on the edge of the bed, gazing intently into her eyes. "Well, it's not all that certain. I've reviewed your medical history, and I have my assumptions. But first I'll need your consent. Are you willing to take that risk?" Chloe hesitated. On the one hand, skepticism and disbelief, but on the other hand, a desperate hope simmered somewhere in the depths of her soul. But she whispered, "There's nothing to lose, it seems to me. Let's give it a try." Dixon's treatment proved to be a stern test. Andrew Evans, the clinic's chief physician, immediately absolved himself of all responsibility by making Dixon sign a document to that effect. Unusual treatments, infusion with bitter-tasting herbs, strict diet, all this exhausted Chloe even more. But she stubbornly followed the doctor's instructions. Sometimes in rare moments of enlightenment, it seemed to her that the condition seemed to improve. But then weakness overcame her again, erasing the fragile sprouts of hope. And Dylan never once visited his wife. He'd only called once, coldly inquiring about her condition. "So have the doctors given their prognosis yet?" Colorless voice asked the husband. "I don't know, Dylan, I don't know," Chloe replied tiredly. "I'm not asking anymore." I see, he gritted through his teeth. "Listen, Chloe, I've been thinking. Anyway, so let's formalize the divorce. It'll be better for everyone." Chloe was silent, feeling her insides freezing. So everything was over definitively and irrevocably. "Can you hear me, Chloe?" "I can hear you," she replied quietly. "Do whatever you want. I don't care." Dylan did not call again. Chloe, having collected the rest of the funds and taking a large loan from the bank, bought a farm with elite horses which she had dreamed of for so many years. From a business point of view, the purchase was very well thought out. But she wanted so badly to please herself, even with the help of huge debts. It didn't matter. But how much of that life was left? And a few days later, Chloe felt quite bad. Her head was dizzy. Colored circles swam before her eyes, and her heart clenched with pain, as if trying to break free. She tried to call for help, but her lips refused to move. Her eyelids felt leaden. The last thing that Chloe remembered was the worried face of the nurse, leaning over her, and Dixon's voice, giving orders when it began. For the first minute, she thought she was in hell. All around her there was pitch blackness. The air was heavy, and a stiffening pain emanated from her body. She tried to move, but realized she was enclosed in a tight space. Panic gripped her in an icy grip. Where was she? What was wrong with her? Suddenly, voices came to her hearing, which she later found out belonged to two young gravediggers. She was brought out of her state of sad reflection by the voice of Ethan, the caretaker, who became worried that her guest had become engrossed in herself. A new herbal tea was available on the table in front of her. Preston set a plate of hot potatoes and a piece of bread beside it. "Eat, daughter, eat. You need your strength," he grumbled, stroking his graying beard. "You've had enough fear, haven't you?" I could only nod. I couldn't say another word. My head was still clammy with the horror that made my blood run cold, and my memory was quick to recall every detail: the darkness, the smell of damp earth, and the voices. And then there was the creak of the shovel on the gravel and her own scream, full of terror and despair, which no one heard. "Thank you, Ethan," Chloe whispered, raising her eyes to him. "You saved my life, didn't you?" Ethan blushed and muttered that he didn't really need to thank her. He'd just done what anyone else would have done. "So what happens now?" Chloe asked after a brief silence. "After all, I've been presumed dead." Chloe realized that she had to tell the truth to the doctor. The doctor would be blamed for her death. At that moment, she immediately remembered Dixon, his tired voice, his insistence on treatment. He was the only one who believed that Chloe could get better. And now, because of this ridiculous incident, his career could be ruined. "I need to go into town right away," she said firmly. "I have to let everyone know the truth. It's already evening, and my car is acting up," Ethan said with his arms. "We'll drive it tomorrow morning. Don't worry." But she couldn't leave it for tomorrow. Every minute felt like her last. "Ethan, please," she begged. "Find a car, please. I'll pay for everything." Ethan hesitated for a while, but then sighed and, nodding, went out of the gatehouse. Chloe looked after him hopefully. Half an hour later, an old Jegulanox stopped at the gate of the cemetery. Ethan helped her to get into the cabin, and the car started. "I'm sorry to drag you into all this," she said, realizing the lengths Ethan had gone to for her. "It's nothing. Never mind," Ethan brushed it off. "You should have seen me when I pulled you out of the grave. That's where I was scared." Chloe smiled involuntarily. "Dixon was right," she said, looking thoughtfully out of the window. "He said there would be a second birth. And though there was still much about this second birth that was unclear and frightening, one thing she knew: she would fight for herself, for her life, and for the man who wasn't afraid to defy death for her. "Don't worry so much," Ethan said soothingly, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "We'll figure it all out in a moment." She nervously tried to calm her shivers after the horror she'd experienced. The thought of going to the police made her unsure. "It's easy to say we'll figure it out," she muttered, looking out the window at the cars whizzing by. "The police wouldn't believe me. They'd say I was crazy. Who comes back from the dead to claim resurrection anyway?" "You're not crazy at all," Ethan said firmly, giving her a brief glance. "You were indeed mistreated, but we'll prove it. I mean, we have proof. After all, Ben did testify." "What if Andrew Evans, the head doctor, had it all figured out?" Chloe asked, feeling panic coming to her. Ethan braked sharply at the curb, causing Chloe to clutch the door in fright. "Chloe, listen to me, please," he said, turning to her. "I don't know what this Andrew Evans is up to, or whether anyone else is involved, but we must try, or all these scoundrels will go unpunished. You don't want that, do you?" Chloe shook her head negatively. "No, I don't. But I don't want to go to jail for slander either." "No one will put you in jail," Ethan said confidently. "You're the victim in this story. You just need to tell it like it really happened. And I'll be there for you." He smiled encouragingly, and Chloe felt the tension release a little. This gentleman with such warm eyes and calm voice gave her a strange feeling of security. "Okay," she nodded. "Let's give it a try." Ethan started the car again, and soon they pulled up in front of the police building. The office of the investigator on duty was small. Behind a desk piled with papers sat a man in his 40s with tired eyes and a surly expression. "Well, tell me," he said, casting a quick glance at them. "What's the incredible story?" Chloe gulped, feeling a lump coming up to her throat, and was ready to tell everything, when suddenly a panting policeman burst into the office. "It's about the gorilla," he said, and only then he noticed the investigator. "I'm sorry, Comrade Major, I didn't know you were busy. An hour." "Speak," the major waved his hand. "So what is it?" "Andrew Evans's lawyer is there," reported the policeman. "He wants to see you about the statement of citizen Degtyareva." "Degtyareva and Eva Dmitrievna," Chloe prompted. "Yes, Degtyareva and Eva Dmitrievna," the policeman finished. She felt her hands go cold. Andrew Evans was already here. Did he know she was coming to the police, and had time to get a lawyer? "Invite a lawyer," the major ordered. A few minutes later, a man in an expensive suit appeared in the office with a briefcase in his hands. "Hello," he said, smiling a broad professional smile. "Andrew Evans asked me to tell you that he sincerely regrets the misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Chloe questioned, not believing her ears. "You call it a misunderstanding? You almost buried me alive." "I assure you, Chloe, there was an unfortunate mistake," said the lawyer, not even blushing. "My client is deeply shocked by what happened. He has already dismissed the doctor, who was responsible for this tragic mistake, and is ready to pay you a generous compensation for moral damage." After these words, he took out a Scotch-wrapped cellophane bag from his briefcase and handed it to Chloe. "Here is $5 million. I hope that this amount will be enough to forget about this unpleasant incident as a terrible dream." Chloe pushed the offering away with disgust. "Do you think your money can compensate for what I've been through?" Emily shrieked. "I want Evans to answer for his crimes. He wanted to cover his tracks, so he refused to do an autopsy. And I'm not the only one. I know I'm not the first person to suffer at his hands." "Chloe, calm down," the major said glumly. "Do you have proof?" "Yes, I have proof," she said firmly, meeting her gaze with the frightened eyes of the lawyer. "And I am prepared to provide it, but only in exchange for complete anonymity and protection." The lawyer nodded in agreement and walked out of the office with his lips pressed together. The next few days passed like in a fog. Chloe testified to the investigators, telling them everything she knew about Evan's machinations. And in fact, Dixon did everything right and was able to improve the patient's condition. But when there was a crisis, the head doctor realized that it was necessary to organize a funeral as soon as possible, so that the prosecutor's office did not get to the body and did not accuse him of everything that had happened. The next day, Chloe stood at the gate of the detention center, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. Her heart was beating in a frantic rhythm, anticipating the imminent meeting. The massive iron door creaked open, and Dixon, her physician, appeared on the threshold, an unwilling prisoner of this gloomy stronghold. His usually cheerful eyes were full of sadness, and his face was a mask of weariness. Seeing her with the bouquet, he could not restrain a warm smile. "Chloe, are you alive?" he whispered, not believing his eyes. "Alive, Dixon," Emily replied with a smile, holding out the flowers. "And it's all thanks to you. Apparently I was allergic to one of the drugs, which caused a state of coma, which the head doctor mistook for death." Dixon smiled and awkwardly accepted the bouquet, still unable to believe in the reality of what was happening. "But how?" he began. But she stopped him with a wave of her hand. "All later," she said. "The main thing now is that you are free. There's a car waiting for you." Indeed, there was a cab at the curb, its driver looking impatiently at his watch. "Get in," gently pushed Emily Dixon to the car. "You need to rest, come to your senses." "And what about you?" he asked anxiously. "I'm fine now. Your treatment seems to have caused me remission," Chloe assured him. "I need to see someone else." She waited until the cab was out of sight, and only then she went to her car. All the way to the house, she did not leave a strange feeling of desolation. So much energy had been devoted to fighting for justice, for Dixon's freedom, and for the truth to prevail. What now that the goal had been reached? Emily felt alone. "I hope this passes," she tried to reassure herself as she turned down the familiar alley leading to the house. But as soon as she parked at the gate, her heart thudded with a bad feeling. Dylan's car was parked there. Chloe opened the gate, entered the yard, feeling the anxiety growing with every step. The door was ajar. Muffled voices came from inside. She quietly climbed the porch, peered into the living room. Her husband was sitting in an armchair with his leg over his leg. He was wearing the silk robe Chloe had given him for their wedding anniversary. Opposite, on the 60 coffee table, was Tricia, her personal hairdresser, a young and spectacular brunette. "Dylan, are you sure this is the shade you want?" flirtatiously asked Tricia, showing him the palette with colors. "Yes, everything is so." Dylan lazily stretched out, sipping whiskey from a crystal glass with pleasure. Chloe froze in place, unable to utter a word. Her head was buzzing. Dark circles floated in front of her eyes. So he was cheating. All this time while Emily was fighting for her life. For justice, he was having fun with someone else. Tricia, noticing her reflection in the mirror, shrieked and dropped the palette, the paints scattered across the floor like multicolored confetti. Chloe Preston. Voices rounded with horror. Dylan turned around and the glass slipped out of his hand, shattering into 1,000 shards. "Chloe, you're dead," he mumbled, stammering, pale as a sheet. "Yes, Dylan? It's me," Chloe said slowly, entering the room. "And you must have thought that I was already rotting in the grave." Dylan nervously twitched his apple of his eye. I can explain everything about this." Taking a step toward him, she backed away. "It's not necessary, Dylan. I can see everything perfectly well." Chloe looked around the living room. Broken glass, scattered paints, frightened face of Tricia, frozen window glass, everything spoke for itself. "Chloe Preston, I had nothing to do with it," he ventured. "What did you say?" she retorted. "I'm dead," Chloe finished coldly. "Yes, Tricia, have you heard about it? My lawyer has undoubtedly notified all concerned." Dylan raised his head. "What are you talking about?" Chloe grinned. "Don't pretend, Dylan. I know about your affairs. I know how you waited for my death to get the inheritance." "That's not true," Dylan exclaimed, blushing like a cancer. I loved you." "Do you love Tricia now?" Chloe asked, not taking her eyes off her husband. He turned pale, opened his mouth, but could not utter a word. "You see," sighed Chloe, "no more lies. I'm filing for divorce." "Divorce? But what about?" Dylan looked around helplessly, as if looking for support. "It's very simple." Chloe took out an envelope from her purse and threw it on the table. "Here are all the documents. Sign them when you familiarize yourself." She turned to Tricia. "And I advise you to hurry up before I change my mind." Chloe turned around and left the house. Getting into the car, she let herself burst into tears. Her heart was torn with pain and resentment. So many years of marriage. Didn't it mean anything to him? "Chloe Preston, are you sure this is a good idea?" the notary asked with obvious concern. She nodded decisively. "Absolutely," Chloe said confidently, signing the document. "I give a part of my property to Dixon, who after the trial of Grozny's Andrew Evans became the head doctor of the clinic." The notary shook his head. "But this, please." "It's absurd," he muttered. "To give a part of his fortune to a doctor who had been under investigation. Dixon is a good man," calmly replied Chloe. "He deserves it much more than my unfaithful husband." Having given the necessary orders to the notary, Chloe went to the cemetery to meet her savior. "Chloe, are you serious?" Ethan stood on the doorstep of the old woman, not believing his ears. "Farm? Horses?" She smiled. For the first time in a long time. It was genuine. "Totally serious. I've always dreamed of having a farm. You know about horses, don't you?" "Well, I helped my grandfather in the village when I was a kid," Ethan mumbled embarrassedly. "That's great." Chloe clapped her hands. "So it is decided you will be my partner." Life on the farm was quite different from the life a businesswoman was used to. Early rise, hard work, constant care of animals. But the strange thing was that Chloe felt happy. For the first time in her life, she was doing something she really, really liked. Ethan turned out to be an indispensable assistant. He quickly mastered all the necessary subtleties of horse care, and soon the farm began to bring profit. Chloe was surprised to discover her talent as a breeder. Her pets were famous for their beauty and grace. At auctions, they were paid fabulous money for them. "Who would have thought that you would make such a gambler, Ethan?" Here laughed Ethan, watching his wife standing in a snow-white bride's dress. "Life is full of surprises," replied Chloe, lovingly stroking her belly. The baby panted playfully from inside. "Sometimes you just need a change of scenery to find happiness." Dylan had tried to challenge the divorce decree, but to no avail. All his attempts to regain at least part of Chloe's fortune failed. Tricia found out he was broke and dumped him. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be ridiculed by the whole town?" he whispered, meeting her once on the street. "You ruined my life." She looked at her ex-husband calmly. Dylan, I didn't ruin your life. You did it yourself when you chose family life over a cheap affair, she said. A year passed. The firm prospered, and Chloe and Ethan got married. Their wedding was modest, but very heartfelt. The witnesses were loyal friends in the person of the head Dr. Dixon and his young wife, Emily. Ben and Preston were the guests of honor. Chloe, you have given me a new life. Thank you for what you are, said Ethan, hugging his wife. You made me happy, she answered, leaning into his shoulder. His eyes shone with love and gratitude. Life, which at first seemed ruined, had found a new meaning, as indicated by the noticeably rounded belly.